Welcome to my YouTube channel, Scary Tales. Now you will dive into horror stories that will shock you. And you please subscribe to the channel, put a like and write in the comments from which page and city, and at what time you watch my video. Enjoy watching.
When I was in my senior year of high school, I did something stupid that I regret to this day. That day was our last bell. We were officially graduated, and to celebrate, Sarah invited us to her house for a farewell gathering. She told us she would be alone all weekend as her parents had gone to visit her grandparents in another state. We arranged to meet after school and leave together from there. We were all very excited as we were about to start a new stage of our lives. Each one of us would start our way through college, and this would probably be our last party together. So we were between the joy of having graduated and the nostalgia of knowing that things would no longer be the same. Sarah talked about how she had a surprise for us, said we would do something different to remember the day as something special, and then she looked in my direction out of the corner of her eye. At first I didn't quite know what she had in mind, but I didn't think much of it. Sarah and I arrived first, then Ben, Matt and Chris, and finally Emily and Laura. On the way to Sarah's house, we made a collection to buy beer and tequila. We left in Sarah's car. Up to that point, none of us knew where she lived. She told us it was around the City Hall area, and we just went with it. After a while, we arrived at a gated community with 2 guards at the entrance. They greeted her nicely and let us pass. It looked like a pretty fancy neighborhood, and the houses were very big and nice. Sarah parked in front of a huge 2-story house with a beautiful roof and a huge garden. We all gawked and started joking about how we had a dick friend and didn't know it. You know, boy nonsense. We all had a good laugh about it, even Sarah herself. As soon as we got into the house, we took over the living room and started passing out the beers. Once the party had started, I lost track of time. The truth is, we were having a great time, but I had to be home before 12 o'clock, and I had no idea how to get out of there. So I took advantage of a moment when I lost sight of Sarah to rest on the couch. I stayed like that for a few minutes, but when I tried to get up, I felt very dizzy. I have to admit that I had been mixing beer with tequila, a beginner's mistake, but I couldn't go home in that state, so I decided to stay a little longer to recover. That's when I saw Sarah coming down the stairs with a Ouija board box and a notebook in her hands. She came over to me and sat down next to me, looking up at me with a defiant smile on her face. Sarah knew that these things scared me to death, but at that moment I was drunk, and Sarah's look of defiance awakened my competitive spirit. So I pushed the glasses and cans away from the coffee table, snatched the box from her hands and placed it on the coffee table. Upon seeing my gesture, all my friends made a big "oh" that was somewhere between mockery and surprise. Then Ben turned off the music and everyone moved closer, forming a circle around us. Sarah smiled mischievously at me and exclaimed, "Us first." Next, we knelt down in front of the table. She passed the notebook to Emily, who was next to her, and asked her to write down any letters or numbers the planchette pointed out. Then she turned to me and smiled again. We both put our hands on the planchette, and Sarah explained to me not to press down too hard, just to rub it lightly. Having that board in front of me, the bravery of the beginning started to waver. I was very nervous. My hands felt sweaty because, as I told you, this kind of thing always scared me. Especially the Ouija board, because everything I had heard about this game was terrifying. All the guys were silent and stood around us. Then Sarah asked the nothingness in a loud voice, "Do you want to play with us?" A few seconds passed and nothing happened. Then she asked the question again. Nothing. We waited another few seconds and nothing happened either. During those moments, I was nervous and tense all the time, and when I saw that nothing happened, I felt relieved. So I relaxed a little and thought it was all nonsense. At that moment, I took my hands off the board to get up, But Sarah asked me to try one more time, promising that if nothing happened, she would not bother me anymore. At first I refused, but finally I agreed to a last attempt, as my companions, well drunk as they were, began to bother with that I was afraid and stuff. After I accepted the challenge again, Sarah asked Chris to pass her some candles that were on the dining table and to turn off the light. Then she placed a candle on each side of the board and lit them, creating a more mysterious and gloomy atmosphere. After that, she sat back down and instructed me to put my hands on the planchette again. When we finally both had our hands on the planchette, Sarah closed her eyes as if trying to concentrate, paused for a long moment, and asked again, "Do you want to play with us?" She barely finished the sentence, and I felt a slight tremor in the planchette. I opened my eyes in amazement and watched as the planchette now began to shift gently on the board, as if something was pushing it. At that moment, I felt every hair on the back of my neck stand up as the planchette stopped on the word yes. I looked for Sarah's gaze, but she was focused on the Ouija board. Then she asked, "What's your name?" I mentally repeated each letter we scrolled through, and then the name appeared, Lilith. Even though I was terrified, something in me, something I couldn't explain, kept me from running away. The game was real. It wasn't us moving the planchette. Then Sarah asked another question that I didn't understand why she was asking it at that moment. "Are you a demon?" The planchette started to slide towards yes, but stopped just before it got there. We were silent for a moment, holding our breath. I wanted to end the game immediately. I felt short of breath, but Sarah insisted and asked if she wanted to continue playing with us. At that moment, the planchette moved very fast and dragged us towards no. I was scared to death at this point, while several of our friends watched in disbelief and others were probably about to pee their pants like me. I took my hands off the planchette quickly, with my heart racing and fear coursing through me. Sarah looked at me sternly and motioned with her head for me to put them back on. Her eyes had a strange expression that scared me even more. So without taking my eyes off her, I obeyed and placed my fingers on the planchette again. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and asked, "Why don't you want to keep playing with us?" The planchette remained motionless for a few seconds. I was trying to breathe, but fear was squeezing my chest to the point of pain. Suddenly, without warning, the planchette began to move at full speed over the letters one after another. It moved so fast that I could barely follow it with my hands. Then it formed the word Larga-te. And as it reached the last letter, Sarah and I withdrew our hands at the same time, frightened. But then, before our horrified eyes, the planchette moved on its own across the board, very slowly, toward the letter E, completing the word. I felt myself sinking to the floor. The coffee table began to vibrate and the planchette went flying through the air as if someone had hit it. We both jumped up, terrified. The others were already running at full speed towards the door, but when they tried to open it, they couldn't. It seemed as if someone was holding it from the outside. At that moment, a horrible noise was heard at the windows, as if someone or something was scratching at them with something metal. Emily fainted, but Ben caught her just in time, and Chris helped him lay her down on the floor. Meanwhile, Matt and Laura stood hugging each other by the door. The noise at the windows lasted a few seconds, and when it finally stopped, Sarah and I ran into the living room where the candles had gone out and everything was dark now. Sarah tripped over one of the coffee table legs and almost fell face first to the floor. I grabbed her arm to help her up, but when I looked at her face, I was met with a grotesque image. Her face was distorted with a demonic expression, and her eyes were blank. I couldn't take it anymore. I let out a blood-curdling scream and dropped her. Sarah collapsed at my feet and I curled up next to her, covering my head with my hands, overwhelmed by the horror we were living. For a few moments I only heard the terrified screams of the others, and suddenly, Everything went silent. I opened my eyes slowly, and now Sarah was beside me, bleeding from her mouth, nose, and eyes. In the distance, someone was shouting from outside, asking if we were okay, but I didn't answer. What was I going to say? I just walked over to Sarah and hugged her, feeling the blood soaking through my clothes. The security guards called an ambulance and the police. Sarah wouldn't wake up, and none of the police believed us when we told them about the Ouija board. They looked at us in disbelief and repeated over and over again, what drugs were they on? Sarah was in the hospital for almost a month and a half. Her parents would not let me visit her. They were convinced that we had brought drugs to the party and that it had almost killed their daughter. When Sarah finally got out of the hospital, we couldn't contact her. She closed her social networks and changed her phone number. We don't know if she did this of her own free will or it was her parents' decision, but we haven't heard from her since. This was 5 years ago, and since then none of us have heard from Sarah again. A colleague said that she moved to Spain with her family after the incident, but no one knows for sure. A few years ago, I decided to work part-time as a nanny. I was only 17 years old at the time. My parents were a couple of irresponsible addicts, so I had no choice but to work at whatever I could to save up and get out of the house. From an early age, I had to learn to fend for myself, as my parents were not even capable of taking care of themselves, let alone a child. Fortunately, in my early years, I had the care of my maternal grandmother, who practically took over the role of my mother, but she passed away when I was 13 years old. Since then, my life has been in chaos. I don't even understand why it is that I myself am not an addict like them, being that I was always exposed to their vices. But I guess that is precisely the reason. Knowing firsthand the ravages that alcohol and drugs can do to your body and mind made me have a great animosity towards any kind of substance that can make me lose control of my own being. As I was telling you, the whole nightmare started one day when I was coming back from a car washing job that a friend had arranged for me. My father was supposed to pick me up, but after half an hour of waiting, I decided to walk. The way home was through a dense forest that was a little scary, but I had no choice. Knowing my dad, he was most likely too drunk to get up and pick me up. At that moment, I was about to turn a corner when I saw something stuck to a big tree. The wind had half ripped it off, so I walked over and saw that it was a missing persons sign. Underneath, another piece of paper was peeking out. I peeled it off and saw that it was an ad looking for a babysitter. I wasn't sure whether to apply or not, so I kept it to think about it at home. When I got home, I saw smoke coming out of the kitchen window. I rushed in and found my mother lying on the floor unconscious. My father was passed out on the couch, both stoned out of their minds. They were lucky I got there in time, otherwise the whole house would have burned down with them in it. Fortunately, I was able to control the situation and woke them both up. It was the first time I yelled at them, "You're a couple of sick people. You shouldn't have children if you can't even take care of yourselves." I was so angry and frustrated that I ran to my room and started packing. The next morning, I called the number in the ad, and, as luck would have it, I got the job. So without a second thought, I grabbed a cab and set off for my new life. After a while on the road, the cab driver turned right and we drove down a dirt road that went into the woods. At first I was a little scared, but when we came to a huge iron gate, I realized how rich these people were. This was not a house. It was a mansion. I got out of the cab, and after paying him, he left immediately. I pressed the intercom button and a man answered, "Please hold." A few seconds later, the gate opened with a metallic creak, and an older gentleman dressed like a butler came to meet me. "Welcome to the Easting Woods residence," he said. "Oh, please follow me." The man took my suitcase and began walking toward the house. I followed him, wondering how big that property would be. The garden was impressive. It was perfectly landscaped with bushes pruned with great care and flowers as beautiful as I had ever seen in my life. The mansion was impressive and very modern. It had huge panoramic windows and the walls were so white that they seemed to glow in the sunlight. It was also gigantic and impressive. As soon as the man turned the doorknob, I saw a tall, handsome man, about 40 years old, standing near a carved wooden staircase, smoking a cigar. He exhaled a cloud of smoke and said in a deep voice, "I'm Mr. Miller. You must be Emily. My wife spoke to you earlier." "Yes, Mr. Miller." "Thank you for inviting me," I replied, a little nervously. Mr. Miller smiled and said to the butler, "Arthur, take Miss Emily to her room." Then he turned to me and said, "Go with him and freshen up. See you at lunch." I nodded and followed the old man in silence. The house was so quiet that I felt uncomfortable every time my footsteps echoed on the very elegant marble floor. My room was downstairs to the left, across the hall, and I swear I had never been in such a luxurious room. The pillows were so soft, and the bed so huge that I was afraid to touch them, lest I spoil them. The butler set my bags down near the table and said, "Lunch is at 12:30. Press the white switch if you need anything." I nodded, and he left the room. After a hot, relaxing shower, I went to the dining room at the appointed time. Mr. Miller was already sitting there. The table was full of food, and some of the dishes looked like something out of a cooking magazine. It was impressive for a poor girl like me who hadn't gotten past a hamburger and fries. I sat down at the place indicated, and he said, "Here comes my wife and our daughter, Lily." At that moment, I turned toward the door and saw a small blonde woman enter the dining room with a creepy-looking doll. The doll was dressed as if she were a real little girl, and so I made the mistake of asking, "And where's the little girl?" I asked quietly, half confused. Mr. Miller looked at me with an uncomfortable expression, and Mrs. Miller spoke in a high-pitched, squeaky voice and an expression I couldn't decipher at the time. "Are you blind, child? Here's our daughter, Lily." And she placed the doll on the chair in front of me. I felt extremely humiliated and confused at the same time. All through lunch, I felt like I was in a nightmare. At first, I thought it was a joke, but Mrs. Miller treated that doll as if she was a real child. She would talk to her and laugh while feeding her soup. The food dripped all over the doll, but Mrs. Miller didn't seem to mind, just wiping it up and making jokes about how she still couldn't eat properly and always made leaks. Her behavior was a clear sign that she was mentally unstable. No one said a word during the entire meal, and that's when I realized I had made a big mistake in coming here. After lunch, Mrs. Miller took me to her daughter's room and handed me a list. "Every day you must follow this schedule for Lily. If you skip even one chore, she will be very upset. And believe me, the last thing you want is an upset Lily." My heart began to beat faster with each task she described to me. This must be a nightmare, I thought. This woman was completely insane. I quietly picked up the list and went to my room. On the way, I ran into Mr. Miller, who apologized for his wife's behavior and finally explained what was wrong with her. He told me that 2 years ago, Mrs. Miller had given birth to a little girl named Lily. When the child was 1 year old, she slipped out of the crib and went to the stairs, and before anyone could catch her, she slipped and fell. She died instantly. Since then, Mrs. Miller had lost her mind and clung to Lily's favorite toy, insisting that her daughter was still alive. Mr. Miller sighed deeply and said to me, "Believe me, Emily, I hate to humor him in this madness, but I've already lost my daughter. I can't lose my wife too." Knowing this, I now felt bad for the couple, and, having no other choice, I decided to play along. Besides, what they were paying to take care of that doll was 4 times what I earned washing cars. That's not counting that I would enjoy all the amenities of this mansion, including a room that was the size of my parents' entire apartment, so it wasn't a bad deal at all. I started taking care of the doll as if she were Lily, following the list Mrs. Miller had given me. I would wake her up in the morning, bathe her, change her clothes, and even take her for walks in her stroller. But as time went on, strange things began to happen. One night, after dinner, I took Lily to her room to put her to bed. The last task of the day was to sing Lily a lullaby so she could sleep peacefully. Mrs. Miller's list specified that I was to sing it in full before putting her down for the night. And so I did. I continued the charade for almost a week, but on the 5th night I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted from devoting all my energy to caring for a doll and longed to go to bed early. So I hummed a few lines of the lullaby and got up to leave, laying the doll carefully in her crib and turning off the bedroom light. Back in my bed, I couldn't stop thinking about how much longer I would endure this madness. Thoughts whirled around in my head until I fell asleep. I don't remember the exact time, but I woke up feeling little fingers tickling my feet. Then I opened my eyes, still sleepy, and that's when I saw the silhouette of a little girl riding on my bed, on all 4s. In a sleepy voice, the little girl said, "Please let me sleep, Emily," and then rolled over and let out a chilling giggle. At that moment, the dream was completely scared away, and I jumped up, turned on the lamp with my heart beating a mile a minute to see who it was, but found myself all alone in the room. What the hell had I seen? I got up drenched in sweat and went to the bathroom to wet my face. As I looked out the window, I saw Mrs. Miller outside, running into the woods and yelling, "No, Lily, go back to Mommy." I immediately ran outside, thinking she was having a nervous breakdown. I saw her heading toward the left side of the garden, so I ran in that direction trying to stop her. Her white nightgown was glowing in the dark as she went into the woods in the middle of the night, and that scared the hell out of me. So without a second thought, I followed her there. At some point, I lost sight of her and found myself in the middle of the forest, disoriented and in the middle of the immensity of the night. Now I was disoriented, so I wandered through the forest, not knowing what to do. There was no one around me, and I could only hear the hooting of owls mixing with the howling of coyotes in the distance, because we were so close to a mountain. This made me feel as if I had entered a world where I did not belong. I turned around trying to get my bearings, and that's when I came face to face with Mrs. Miller. She was staring at me like a maniac, her eyes bloodshot and almost piercing my soul with her gaze. The woman was somewhere between angry and scared. Then she grabbed me by the shoulders and yelled at me, "What did you do? What did you do to make her mad? I told you to follow the list. Why didn't you listen to me?" I just stood there frozen, wide-eyed and scared to death. Then she turned toward the dark woods and cried out in pain, "Lily, honey, come back to Mommy. Mommy will take good care of you." "Mrs. Miller, please calm down. Lily is not alive. You have to accept that. Please stop this," I said, feeling that I couldn't take this charade anymore, and that this was going too far. "What are you saying? You can't hear her cry. Listen," she shouted so close to my face that her saliva splattered on me. She sounded desperate, almost crazed. I was going to say this was all crazy, but my lips were immediately sealed when, behind me, a baby's cry rose up loudly. This was an angry but painful cry, like the cry of a baby who is hungry or what wants to be given something. But this one was so loud and eerie that it made my ears screech. I was completely stunned. My head was pounding, and my heart now felt it in my throat, but I couldn't move. I stood there paralyzed with terror as the psychotic crying got louder and louder. Mrs. Miller laughed like a madwoman at the sight of my petrified face. "Now if you think you're alive, don't you? Are you happy now? Look what you did to my daughter. You made her cry." I turned around slowly, feeling every muscle in my body stiffen, and to my utter amazement, I saw a little girl standing some distance away, holding that diabolical doll. The girl had no eyes. Instead, darkness gushed from her empty sockets and black vomit spewed from her mouth as her jaw opened grotesquely, almost to her chest. At that moment, I swear, I almost felt my heart stop. I screamed at the top of my lungs until I collapsed on the floor. I don't know how much time passed, but what I learned later is that the housekeeper found me unconscious in the woods the next morning. I had a very high fever, and Mr. Miller called my parents to come get me. My parents came, thankfully sober, and took me home. I did not speak, nor did I leave my room for almost a month. I never talked to my parents about what happened there, and they never brought it up either. I guess they were just happy to have found their daughter alive. It took me months to get back to my normal life, although in a way my life was never normal again. Not after what I had seen and heard in the woods that horrifying night. To this day, I often wake up hearing that angry cry of a baby, accompanied by Mrs. Miller's voice. "Lily, honey, come to Mommy. I'll sing you a lullaby." It was the summer of 1993 in Glendale, California. The one summer I wish I could forget forever. I had just bought an old motel on the outskirts of town and hadn't had time to renovate anything, so the place was still a mess, even a little spooky. I'm not a person with too much money. I basically spent my savings plus a bank loan I applied for in order to pay for this place, but I really didn't have a penny left over to remodel it. So now I had to produce to be able to make the pertinent repairs. The doors and walls hadn't aged well at all, and there was no decent air conditioning, just ceiling fans that didn't do much against the infernal California heat. Luckily, I already had a few guests, and the season seemed to be off to a good start. I was getting ready for bed that day when I heard the front desk door close. I looked towards the entrance, but saw no one. That gave me the creeps, you know. This place was old, and there are a lot of urban legends in this town about haunted hotels and stuff. Suddenly I heard heavy breathing that seemed to come from nowhere. It was faint, but I realized it was coming from the other side of the reception desk. I looked towards that place and almost fainted when I saw a very thin hand clutching the desk. I approached it very slowly, with bated breath and eyes wide open. I looked over the reception desk and could see nothing, just the hand. Then I looked down and saw that it was a man in a wheelchair. He was a middle-aged man, very thin and gaunt, asking for a room. I felt a little silly at that moment and laughed at myself for how scared I was, thinking he was a ghost. I asked the man how he had arrived, and he pointed to a cab standing outside. I offered him a room on the first floor, but he said no, and insisted he wanted one on the second floor, even though he was in a wheelchair, and said he needed a room with a view. I told him I had no way to help him upstairs, but he ignored him and assured me that the cab driver would do it. Since the customer is always right and I was in no position to refuse anyone, I gave him the keys, thinking he was the type of person who, despite his condition, wanted to do everything alone and was very stubborn. Plus, he paid for 3 nights in advance, so I wasn't going to argue. I watched the cab drive away and decided it was time to lock up and try to get some sleep. It was already late. I went to one of the empty rooms and laid down for the night. It was unbearably hot that night. I remember tossing and turning in bed before collapsing and having the strangest dream in the world. In the dream, I was approaching one of the motel rooms, and as I did, I realized it was 211, the same one where the man in the wheelchair was staying. The door was open and I felt as if something was pulling me in. Slowly I opened the door all the way, and the man was sitting in his wheelchair next to the bed, staring at me. He was frozen, desperately trying to express with his eyes the fear he felt. An immense pressure was pressing on my chest, and I could feel a dark presence in the room. Then he looked briefly to his left, as if someone was behind the door. But when I caught him looking again, I realized that it was something in his peripheral vision, almost behind him, that was causing him so much distress. To my horror, the door began to open on its own, and right there, I woke up. I had never been so relieved to wake up and realize that something so real was just a dream. But I was left with a residual feeling of intense anxiety that made me wonder why I was dreaming about that room and what the man was seeing in that dark corner. Instinctively, I got out of bed and looked out the window. My eyes immediately went to room 211, on the other side of the motel. Everything seemed normal at first until I noticed that one of the blinds was slightly down, as if someone was watching. At first I thought the man was also having trouble sleeping, but then I realized how absurd it was. How could a man in a wheelchair be high enough to look through the blinds? Despite how hot it was in the room, a shiver ran through my body as suddenly the space in the blinds closed in a second, and a strange silence took over. You know, that kind of silence that precedes the storm. I had a bad feeling that the night wasn't over yet, and I wasn't wrong at all. When I got back to bed, loud knocking on the door startled me. I hesitated for a moment whether to open it or not, but the knocking wouldn't stop, so I reluctantly opened it and found another guest who had her luggage in her hand and was asking me to call a cab right away. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she had been awakened by loud footsteps and noises in the room upstairs. Then she started hearing swearing and cursing, to the point that she had to pack up and leave her room. This puzzled me, but I offered her another room to make up for the bad time. However, she refused to accept it, and only insisted that I call a cab to go as far away as possible. I thought I was overreacting, but she seemed really scared, as if she had seen a ghost or something. That's when I saw her room keys and realized it was right under 211. The motel was practically empty, and I had no explanation for the noise, so I went up to 111 to see if I could hear the commotion. I sat on the bed, listening intently, and soon I could hear footsteps and other disturbing noises from above, as if things were being moved. I thought maybe the man had received a late-night visitor, which would explain the footsteps and the person looking through the blind. But what was with all the noise, and why so late? The noise intensified and almost sounded like someone was being attacked. At that point, I decided to go upstairs and approach room 211, which I now knew for certain was the source of all the disturbance. There was no point in knocking on the door. The noise on the other side of the door was too loud. I felt that someone might be in danger, so I simply decided to pick the lock. Luckily, the motel doors were old, and I managed to open it by breaking the lock. I expected to find someone in trouble, but instead, I walked into a room engulfed in darkness and silence. The noise had completely stopped, and I couldn't really understand anything. But then I saw the man in his wheelchair next to the bed, just like in my dream, but he was slumped over and looked fainted. I reached over and touched him, and he was cold, had no pulse. I took 2 steps back in complete horror, and then called the police. The officers arrived a few minutes later and confirmed that he had died. Later it was learned that the cause was a heart attack. There were no signs of a struggle, and the only key to the room was on the table by the window, so there couldn't have been anyone else there. There was no suspicion of a crime. I told the cops about the strange noises, but they didn't believe me. They said it wasn't relevant to the cause of death. A few weeks later, I tried to put it all behind me and made room 211 available for guests again. But every time I set it up, the next morning I found the furniture and everything in disarray. The room downstairs was also uninhabitable, because of the loud noises that continued to be heard every night since the man's death. I still don't have a logical explanation for what happened that night, nor for what continues to happen in that room. It is clear to me that whatever is causing those noises is not of this world. I still run the motel, and fortunately I've done quite well in business, but these rooms are out of order. They simply belong to whatever it is that inhabits room 211. I used to hitchhike often. It was something I started doing when I was in my early 20s, to save money while traveling. I enjoyed meeting new people and hearing their stories, and most of the time, the trips were pleasant and uneventful. But one night I had an experience that still haunts me. It was a cold winter evening, and I was standing on the side of a lonely road. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep color. I had been waiting for almost an hour out in the open, so the cold was already starting to get into my bones, but the road was completely silent, with only the occasional car passing by. I was beginning to think that I might have to spend the night outside when I saw the headlights of a car approaching. I held up my thumb, waiting for the driver to stop, and as he approached, I could tell it was an old, dark blue sedan. The car slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I felt very fortunate that this good Samaritan had stopped to provide help to a stranger in distress, such as myself. I ran to the passenger door and peeked inside. The driver was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a tired expression on his face. He looked harmless, so I opened the door and climbed in. "Where are you going?" he asked me in a low voice. I told him the name of the town, about 50 miles away. He nodded and said he was going in that direction precisely. "Thank you," I said, "for the ride," then closed the door and buckled up as the car started. The first few minutes of the trip were silent. Only the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt could be heard. I looked out the window, watching the trees pass by like distant shadows. I tried to relax during the ride, but for some reason there was something about the man that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me out of the corner of his eye, or how his hands clenched the steering wheel tightly. I couldn't explain it, but something wasn't right. My gut was telling me. As we drove, I noticed a large box in the back seat, covered with a thick, dark blanket. It took up most of the space, and I had seen it when I got in because it was half hidden. Now that I had noticed it, I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was strange to have it there, and I wondered what it contained. The man must have noticed my curiosity because he suddenly cleared his throat and said, "It's just some old stuff." But I could sense some tension in his voice. I nodded, not wanting to be seen as nosy, but curiosity was eating at me. What kind of old stuff would be hidden in such a big box? The man's strange behavior only heightened my suspicions. A few more miles passed in uncomfortable silence. The air inside the car felt heavy, and I began to feel somewhat asphyxiated. I constantly shifted in the seat, trying to find a comfortable position, but no matter how much I moved, the feeling that something was wrong would not go away. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from the back seat. It was so faint at first that I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. It sounded like something or someone was inside the box. I turned to the man with my heart in my stomach. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" he replied in a flat, emotionless tone. I hesitated, not knowing what to say. "I thought I heard something from the back seat," I replied. "It's just road noise. There's nothing to worry about," he said. But I was worried. My heart was racing and a cold sweat was breaking out on the back of my neck. The muffled sounds of the box were getting louder and I started to panic. I needed to get out of that car, so I instinctively looked at the door handle. My mind was going a mile a minute at that point. We were on a deserted stretch of road with no other cars in sight. If I jumped out now, I might hurt myself or worse. But staying in the car didn't seem like a safe option either. As I weighed my options, the man began to hum softly. It was a low, eerie tune that gave me goosebumps. Then his grip on the steering wheel tightened even more, and I could see the tendons in his hands tense. The whirring of the box grew louder and more frantic, and I knew I had to do something and fast. I reached for my phone, trying to be discreet, but the man saw me. His eyes flashed with great anger, and he reached out to grab my wrist. "Don't even think about it," he hissed through his teeth in a tone that was threatening and creepy at the same time. I jerked my hand away, and now my heart was beating like a drum in my chest. The car was still moving, and the man was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The strange sounds coming from the back seat were getting louder and more desperate, and I knew I couldn't stay in that car another second. It was clear that something or someone was in there, and most likely I would be next in that box if I stayed in that car with this psychopath. I took a deep breath and unbuckled my seatbelt very carefully so the guy wouldn't notice. After all, he was very focused humming that creepy song, so I reached for the door handle, but as I did so, the man realized what I was doing and let out an angry growl. "Not a chance," he warned me. But I didn't listen to him. I pulled the handle and pushed the door open. He reached out to grab me, but I was quicker and threw myself out of the car, falling hard to the ground, tumbling across the pavement in the process. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I rolled violently across the asphalt, feeling the rough surface rubbing against my skin. Fortunately, we were in the middle of winter, and I had plenty of warm clothes on, which served to cushion the blows, but I still felt quite sore. The car braked with a shrill screech up ahead, and I heard the man scream, but I didn't look back. I got to my feet and started running off the road. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep moving as I felt the cold air burn my lungs. But I still didn't stop for an instant. All I could think about was getting as far away from that car as possible. I ran until I could run no more and finally collapsed in some bushes about 500 meters from the road. I was gasping for air and my heart was still racing. I don't know how long I lay there shivering with cold and fear, trying to calm down. After that, I walked back towards the road, making sure the psycho's car wasn't around. Then another car pulled up. The driver, a nice woman, and offered to take me to the nearest town. I hesitated for a moment. The fear of getting into another stranger's car was almost paralyzing, but I had no choice. As we drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the box in the back seat of the man's car. What was inside? What was it that I had heard? I'll never know for sure, but I'm thankful I escaped that night. While in the car, I told the lady what I had experienced and called the police. I told her the location where the man had found me and where he was headed, and also the directions to the car. However, I never knew if they actually caught this man. Years ago, last year, but I wasn't sure if I should tell it or not. I'm a bit paranoid and felt that maybe if I talked about it, it might happen again, but enough time has passed and all is quiet, so I'll share it. Oh. First language, I'm Italian, so patience if I say any words wrong. I'm 22 years old, and as I told you, I'm from Italy. To be more specific, I'm from Cosenza, but I study art at the Accademia di Belle Arti di Brera in Milan. At that time, I was at my parents' house for the Christmas vacations. After New Year, my parents' house is in a small town on the edge of the city. They moved there a while ago and live in a nice 2-story house. I was in my room watching horror stories on YouTube, as I love to do. It was about 2 in the morning and I was deep into a scary story, not knowing that I would soon be living my own horror story. started with a Snapchat notification that someone had added me. I was a little weirded out, but I still opened it and saw that someone with the username Lottie789 had added me. This is weird. I hardly ever use Snapchat. I have it on my phone just in case, but none of my friends use it since Instagram started having stories, so I have very few friends on Snapchat and none are active, so I didn't think it was someone I knew. I don't even have my location turned on, or Bitmoji, or anything that would reveal my location or username to people nearby. Don't even think does, because, like I said, Snapchat in a while. I also didn't have my username on any of my social networks, so out of curiosity, I added Lottie789 and opened her profile to see if there were any pictures or anything that would tell me more about this person. There was nothing except for her Snapchat score, which was about 7. I put my phone down on my desk and rewound the video. I had missed while I was distracted. Just as I was getting ready to go back to the video, I got another notification. It was from Lottie789 again, but this I opened it, and it was a picture of a jar of weed taken with a flashlight. I looked at it confused and wrote, "What is this? Who are you?" This user received it and read it, but didn't respond. I asked if it was any of them or if they had given my username to someone, but they all said no. A few seconds came in. Now it was a picture of what looked like a red tile. Curiosity got the better of me and I posted again, "This isn't funny, who are you?" Lottie789 saw my message but did not respond. The third snap came, and this time I was ready to take screenshots to show my boyfriend. It was a picture of a doorknob, but I couldn't see anything else clearly. Get the screenshot. So I had to repeat the snap, and when I finally got it, I went back to the third snap to take a closer look. This time, beads of sweat began to break out on my forehead as I realized that the doorknob belonged to the gazebo. At that point, I began to understand that this person was sending me snaps from my own backyard. And by the way, it's not easy to access our yard. We have a high fence, so their time and scout around to find a way to climb it. It would be even harder in the dark, which meant that whoever it was had been looking around our house during the day to find a way in. I was completely froze for a few moments. Then I jumped out of my chair and ran to turn off all the lights. In the darkness of my room, I peeked through the blinds to see the backyard. That night was cloudy and dark, so I couldn't make it. I received another snap at that moment, and as before, I prepared to take a screenshot of my boyfriend, who had not yet responded to my messages. As I opened the snap, a scream of terror escaped my throat. Image of my window blind, the same one I was looking out of, trying to see him on the patio. I ran out of my room, not knowing what to do. For some inexplicable reason, I didn't want to wake my dad and tell him what was happening. My mom was sleeping downstairs on the couch, so I tried to figure out how to open the loud, creaky patio door without. Despite my fear, I wanted to find the intruder who was playing this ghoulish, evil prank on me. I struggled with the door for what seemed like hours, but finally managed and carefully stepped outside to watch. But I didn't see anyone right away. I looked everywhere,
trying to keep low so the guy... There was no one in the backyard. I was coming down from the terrace when I got another snap from Lottie 789. As I opened it, I felt my blood run cold.
It was a picture of my mom sleeping on the couch taken from inside the house. Now I was panicking. Whoever this monster was, he was now inside my house. Panicked, I ran downstairs screaming, "Dad! Dad! There's someone inside our house! Dad, call the police!" My mom jumped awake at my screams and saw that the front door was wide open. Apparently, we had forgotten to lock it that night, and my mom had fallen asleep on the couch without realizing it. My dad ran out of the house with a baseball bat in his hand. But after a while, he came back in and told them everything while showing her the screenshots. My mom and I were hyperventilating, completely panicked that moment, while my dad called the police and then went upstairs to his room to get his gun, then went out to look around for the guy. After checking everywhere, my dad came back and said he hadn't found anyone. A few minutes later, the cops came and questioned us and our neighbors about the incident, but they didn't get any leads. I could hardly sleep that night. Every 5 seconds I checked my phone for new snaps from that unknown account, but Lottie 789 had disappeared. I would have been relieved to think that this madman, whoever he was, had stayed away, but unfortunately that was not the case. When I woke up, I found a creepy text message from the same account. "Had a good time watching you sleep. Can't wait to see you soon, bye." I immediately blocked the account with fingers shaking and tears welling up in my eyes. Feeling completely desperate and terrified, I texted and called all my friends, begging them to confess if it was any of them. But they all denied being one of them. I told my boyfriend what had happened, and he also asked everyone he knew. But we got nothing. We tried to find the account, but soon discovered that he had deactivated it. No one with the name Lottie 789 existed anymore. I deleted Snapchat and figured I would never use it again. The next day, I went out to look around to see if the intruder had left anything behind and saw footprints in a small mud puddle. My dad didn't think they were the intruder's footprints. He said they probably belonged to one of us, but I'm pretty sure they weren't ours. To this day, I still don't know who it was. I've asked everyone I know, but nothing has ever come up. I still wonder what their intentions were, if they were stalking me, who they were, how they found me. I don't know. I just hope I never have to deal with them again. I had been working the night shift at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town for a couple of months. It's the typical place where not a soul passes by, where the only sounds at night are the hum of the snack machine and the occasional stray car passing by on the road. I've grown accustomed to the tranquility of this place and to being alone. I've always loved that moment of peace when the world seems to be on pause. But lately, something strange has been happening during my shifts. It started about a month ago. I was at the front desk, killing time with an old magazine, when the phone rang. I looked at the clock, and it was almost 3 a.m. "Who calls at that hour?" I muttered. I answered with a hello, but on the other end of the line I only heard a strange noise like heavy breathing. How strange, I thought. I waited for a while, thinking that maybe someone had dialed the motel's number by mistake, but the breathing continued. It was slow and steady, almost like a rhythm, but there was something about it that made my hair stand on end. "Hello, is anyone there?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The breathing stopped, and instead, I heard soft footsteps, as if someone was walking slowly on a wooden floor. And suddenly, just as it started, the call was cut off. I hung up the phone with a shivering sensation all over my body. What the hell was that? I muttered again, but I tried to forget the matter and not make a big deal out of it. Sometimes there are people with nothing to do who like to play telephone pranks, especially at this hour. Maybe it was just some random guy trying to scare me. The next night the phone rang again, almost at the same time. This time there was no breathing, just soft, unintelligible whispers, like a distant conversation. I could not understand anything. My heart started pounding as I tried to catch a word, but the whispers were too low, too distant. Then the sound of footsteps returned, louder and louder, until it felt as if they were in the same room with me. "What the hell?" I said, and hung up with a thump. My hands were shaking and I turned away from the phone. I checked the motel register to see if any guests had checked in that night, but the only occupied rooms were the usual ones. The others were supposed to be empty. But when I looked at the phone screen, I saw that the call had come from one of those empty rooms, 206. Then I got a knot in my stomach. This was really starting to scare me, and if it was a prank, the prankster who was playing me had better hope I didn't find out. The next few nights, the calls continued. Each time the noises were different. Sometimes it was the sound of a door opening, sometimes the soft hum of a music box playing a creepy old tune. But the calls always came from a different empty room. And every time I checked the rooms after the calls, I found nothing. The beds were made, the lights were off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. By the end of the week, I was a nervous wreck. Every time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat and I braced myself for any weird noise coming out of the receiver. I began to dread the long, lonely hours of my shift, wondering what would happen next night, and this began to fill me with anxiety. After another call from an empty room, I decided to investigate thoroughly. I had to know where these calls were coming from, so I grabbed the master key from the desk and headed for the room I had just called. Room 301. My footsteps echoed down the empty hallway as I approached the door to the room. But when I got there, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob for a few moments, before finally turning the key and opening it. The room was dark and cold. I turned on the light and the small lamp on the bedside table cast a dim, eerie glow. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The phone on the nightstand was slightly off the hook, just enough for the call to go dead. I felt a shudder and reached out to put it back in place, but when I hung up the phone, I saw a slip of paper peeking out from underneath. I grabbed it and unfolded it. It was a list of names I didn't recognize, but at the bottom of the list, a word written in red ink: help. I left the room with my mind racing. I knew I had to talk to the motel owner, Mr. Martinez, about this. Maybe he could explain what was going on and why these calls kept coming from supposedly empty rooms. The next night, I approached him as soon as he arrived for his shift, so I told him about the calls, the noises, and the strange things I had found in the rooms the last few days. For a moment, he looked surprised, his face turning pale, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Don't worry," he said in a firm but cool voice. "It's just some old wiring problems, probably. I'll take care of it." But there was something in his tone that finished convincing me. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding out on me. I couldn't concentrate on anything else that night. I kept going over our conversation in my head, wondering what he wasn't telling me. Then, just as I was about to finish my shift, the phone rang once again, and I answered it. My hand was shaking and my heart was already racing because I knew I could hear anything on the other end. At first, the line was silent. Then I began to hear footsteps, but then I heard a familiar voice. It was the voice of Mr. Martinez. It was coming from a room that was supposed to be empty, room 208. But just then, the door opened, and Mr. Martinez walked in, greeted me, and walked down the hall. At that moment, I dropped the phone and ran out the door. I didn't say anything. I didn't even bother to talk to Mr. Martinez. I just got in my car and drove away from that place forever. I never went back to the motel again. Whatever was in that room, it was something much darker than I could ever comprehend. And I didn't want to be around it ever again. My name is Laura and I'm 23 years old. A couple of years ago, I decided to be a content creator in an exclusive platform. You know, the one with the blue logo. And today I want to tell you about a terrible experience I lived some time ago. This happened in 2023. At that time, I was going through economic problems and a friend who was already part of the platform introduced me to OF as an alternative to generate extra income. At first, I didn't really know what it was all about, but then she explained it to me, and it seemed to me that it was nothing complicated. It was just a matter of shaking off my modesty, and that was it. So that same afternoon, I subscribed and started uploading provocative photos for my subscribers. Sometimes I uploaded some videos too, and in a short time I began to realize that the earnings were pretty good. But as I always wanted a little more, after a while, I decided to start getting to know my fans. Those who were more supportive and willing to spend more could pay to spend a night with me. However, as I was aware that these encounters could be risky, I contacted my friend Marcus, a strong guy with martial arts experience. I had an agreement with him. Every time I went on a date with a fan, I would make sure Marcus knew exactly where I was. He would do me a favor, and if he didn't hear from me in a couple of hours, he would come looking for me. In return, I would give him 20% of what I earned on that date. This friend was basically my personal security, something necessary in the environment in which I moved. And for a while it worked perfectly well, until one night I received an invitation from a particular fan. I was talking to a guy named Pablo. At first he didn't seem very sociable. He preferred me to send him pictures rather than chat. I was a bit skeptical, so I ignored his messages. But then I got a text where he bragged about his bank account. "I can pay you more than you can imagine. More than anyone will pay you," it read. The amount he showed was staggering and made me intrigued, so I decided to take him up on his offer. I instantly wrote to Marcus to let him know the address and hours. However, he told me that he was sick, but that he had a friend named Javier who could help me. He met Javier at a boxing class and told me he could be trusted, so he gave him my number. A day later, I received a message from Javier with his contact information and made arrangements with him before I left to meet him. I took a cab and headed to the house Pablo had indicated, and when I arrived, I was surprised to see that it was a fairly normal house, not very luxurious as I had imagined, considering what he had told me about his money. With some hesitation, I knocked on the door and it opened with a creak. Soon a handsome, well-dressed young man appeared with a big smile and bright eyes. He gave me a hug and said, "Hi, you must be Laura. Pablo is waiting for you in the bedroom." At that moment, I realized that the guy in front of me was not Pablo. What a pity, I thought. I was a bit disappointed, so I asked him, "Can you take me to the bedroom?" The guy kindly led me to the second floor, and when he opened the door, I got a big surprise. I found an older man, around 70 years old, waiting inside. The situation was totally unexpected and left a bad taste in my mouth. It was a total disaster. I stared at the older man on the bed with his white hair and wrinkles that almost made him look like a ghost, and when he saw me, his eyes seemed to light up with a mixture of desire and madness. "Hi, I'm Pablo, your biggest fan," he said, smiling at me in a haunting way as a drop of saliva slipped from his mouth. In that instant, I knew I wanted nothing to do with him, no matter how much money he offered me. "I'm sorry, Pablo. I think this was a mistake." Turning around, I tried to run away, but the young man who had led me here pushed me away and slammed the door shut. I panicked and tried to open it, but it was locked. I barely managed to scream and bang on the door for help, but Pablo interrupted me. "There's no one to help you. No one will hear your screams, honey. If you try to resist, my son will come and do dreadful things that, believe me, you will want to avoid." I knew at that moment that the boy who had brought me was his son. What kind of family was this? In desperation, I stopped struggling with the door, realizing I had no choice but to endure the situation. Paul seemed to notice my anger and began to laugh as he told me he wanted everything to be fun. I had never felt so helpless in my life, but I knew that fighting back could only complicate things more. I was at the mercy of that pair of guys, and making it difficult for me could only trigger something worse. In the end, I was forced to get out of this one and started to undress. I just wanted this to be over quickly so I could get the hell out of here and go home. "That's my girl," he commented with a chuckle, as I felt increasingly trapped and humiliated. I tried to reach into my pockets for my phone, but I quickly understood. Pablo's son had pulled it out while hugging me. Frustration invaded me entirely, and I could only wait for Javier, Marcus's friend, to notice that something was wrong and come to save me. In the meantime, I decided to buy time, so I started dancing while I undressed, and I made sure to spend a good amount of time doing that. At first, Paul was excited, but then he started to get impatient. However, when I told him that this was all part of foreplay, he seemed to calm down. Then I tried to play with him by running around the room, telling him to try to catch me. I hid under the bed laughing to make him think it was a game. I wanted him to think I was enjoying this, but I was really just trying to slow him down. A few minutes passed and he seemed to be getting tired, so I finally told him I needed to go to the bathroom. "I can't wait any longer," he said as he grabbed my wrists. I tried to break free, but that old man was stronger than he looked, and after a struggle that felt like forever, I managed to break free from his grasp. I gave him a punch and he screamed for help. At that instant, his son burst into the room, grabbed me, and started hitting me. In the midst of the confusion, my phone slipped out of Pablo's son's pocket and fell to the floor. Without thinking, I reached out, grabbed it, and managed to dial Javier's number. It was then that the young man punched me in the face, snatching the phone from my hands, and almost immediately I heard another cell phone ring. I looked and saw that he also had a phone. At that moment, the truth hit me like a train. I realized that the guy I was fighting with was none other than Javier himself. Realizing that he had found out, Javier threw my phone against the wall and started laughing as he held me with his big hands, squeezing my neck. In that instant, everything felt dark. I didn't know how I was going to get out of this hell, but I realized two things. One, that there was a huge window in the room, and two, that one of my heels was lying next to me. So, in a completely desperate act, I reached for the shoe, and with all the strength I had left, I smashed it into Javier's eye. He gave a blood-curdling scream and pushed me away. Then I saw that there was blood coming out of his eye, and without thinking too much, I took the opportunity and ran to the window. I jumped without a second thought, shattering the glass, which tore my skin as I jumped out, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of that hell. I landed on the lawn, sore, lacerated, and a mess, but happy to escape from that nightmare. The first thing I did was to go to a friend's house, which was the closest thing to the place. I could barely talk about what had happened, but I told her everything, and we decided to call the police and gave them all the details we could. At first, I hesitated to call Marcus, because after what I had been through, I was panicking that he was in on the same plot, but I finally made the call and told him what had happened to me and Javier. Marcus was as shocked as I was and promised to help me with the investigation, offering all the information he had about him to the authorities. Soon after, the police caught Javier and Pablo, and I can't tell you how relieved I was to know that those monsters would be behind bars. Still, what I experienced left a mark on me that I will never forget. Since that day, I decided to stop using fans. I used to enjoy making content on the platform, but now it only brings back memories of a nightmare that I never want to relive again. Even though I tried to move on, the nightmares come back often, reminding me of the terror I lived through. This may not be a story of hope or even a pretty one, but the truth is that I have learned to live with the pain. Unlike many people who face trauma and heartbreaking situations, for me, life has always been a challenge to overcome. I never knew happiness, and that is perhaps the reason I survived what I am about to share. Since I was a child, my parents made it clear that they did not love me. Every day, was a struggle to avoid their yelling and hitting, and any small mistake could trigger a slap in the face or a humiliating insult. Eventually, I learned that my worth was below zero, and sadly, I began to believe it. Life didn't get better as I got older. When I stopped trying to please my parents to earn the affection they would never have from me, I began to find excuses to escape from home, if only for a few hours. I would venture out into the streets where, despite the dangers, at least there was a sense of freedom. Being away from home, even for a moment, always felt like a relief. One night, after a fierce fight with my father, he threw me into the basement. In the dark and in between sobs, I heard his voice next to my mother's. "Unfortunately, you are our daughter and everyone knows it. How do you think it feels to have people see you as a tramp out there, as a complete loser? Are you doing this to humiliate us? Is this what you want after all we did for you?" My father was saying with restrained rage. "Don't worry, we'll find a solution to this," he added. And I was left in the gloom, trying to contain my fear. The next morning brought with it a disturbing revelation. A young man arrived at the house with a pleasant smile, but one that failed to disguise my fear. My father introduced him as if he were an object for sale. "This is James, and from now on he will be taking care of you." In that instant, I understood the unthinkable. My parents had sold me. The car ride to their house was long and silent. James spoke little, and I had no energy to start a conversation. However, he gave me some comfort by telling me that he was aware of how my parents had treated me, and that everything would soon change. At that moment, I thought that maybe, just maybe, life with him wouldn't be so bad. When we arrived at his cabin in the middle of a snowy wilderness, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. The place was welcoming from the outside, a haven in the middle of nowhere that felt like a perfect opportunity to start over, away from the horror I knew. James began to show me around the house, but as we approached a door leading to the basement, I noticed a change in his demeanor. As we crossed the threshold, I felt his hand on my back, and before I could react, I was pushed and rolled down the stairs. I was immediately overcome with pain. I rolled, banging against the concrete walls, and suddenly I heard James close the door with a dull thud and turn the key. "Welcome home," he said, his voice lost in the tumultuous darkness. I dropped to the floor, and standing there, I could smell a metallic odor that penetrated my nostrils and made me feel nauseous. As I looked around, I realized the horrifying truth. There were dead bodies. Young women like me, mutilated and bloodied. Horror overcame me, and I began to cry. From then on, time became a blur, and I didn't know when I fell asleep. When I awoke, I saw him standing next to me, and a myriad of anxieties ran through my mind. James was holding a belt, but it was no ordinary belt. It had buckles and sharp points, something I had never seen in my life. At that moment, I understood that I had fallen into an abyss from which it would be difficult to escape. "You're behaving badly," he told me, and without warning, the man next to me began to brutally beat me with that belt. The metal tore my skin from the first blow, and blood ran down my back, taking with it every bit of dignity I had left. At first, I thought I was special, different from the others, but I soon realized that I shared the same fate as all the souls who were in that basement before. To be a victim, forgotten and killed with no one who could remember me. I didn't know how much more I could endure that torment. Then James leaned over to me and whispered disdainfully, "When you disappear, no one will miss you. Your parents sold you as if you were an object, a toy." That revelation was like a blast in my mind. It wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know, but it's different when you hear it from the mouth of the monster they sold you to like you were trash. But for some reason, that statement, instead of destroying me completely, awakened in me an immense desire to survive. It was as if the hatred and resentment I felt for the despicable beings who brought me into the world made my strength reborn. I did not know if I was going to die or not in that place. I only knew that I would not do it without first fighting with all my strength. It was as if the hatred that was born in me overcame my fear. I hated not only him but also my parents for every blow, every insult, and every day of suffering. The days passed and that routine of beatings, humiliations, and sexual and psychological abuse kept repeating itself. But even though my body was suffering like never before in my life, my will was stronger than ever. I had nothing more to lose, and somehow that made the fear fade away. The worst thing that could happen to me was to die, and no one cared about that. Not even me. As the days went by, I noticed that James was becoming more and more violent in his attacks, but also more reckless. And on one occasion, as he raised his belt to hit me again, I decided to make a bold decision. "That's nothing," I shouted angrily at him. "My father was a coward and hit harder than you. You are a child." Her eyes widened in surprise as she heard me. "You're going to judge me and compare me to that man who decided to sell you for pennies? Who do you think you are?" Angrily, he threw the belt aside and began to beat me with his fists. Each blow became more furious and uncontrolled, and being honest, I don't know how I endured them, but as I told you, my will felt iron, and at that moment I knew it was now or never. At that moment, concentrating all my strength in one last instant, I lunged at him. His hands were raised to strike again, and with full force I buried my nails in his eyes and began to snarl his face like a wild beast, and his screams of pain and fury echoed throughout the cabin. He had underestimated me, and it cost him dearly. He was somewhere between furious and in shock, because I'm sure he never expected me to defend myself, let alone in such a ferocious way. Is that I don't even know where I got my strength from myself, but each scratch was like a knife digging into his skin, opening furrows and tearing chunks out while one of his eyes bled profusely. Then, taking advantage of his bewilderment, I pushed him with all my strength. He stumbled and fell heavily to the ground. I then took that brief opportunity to get up. My legs were shaking, but the instinct to survive was stronger than the pain, so I ran to the stairs and opened the door, closing it behind me on my way out and securing it with a chair, something that was surplus to requirements, because in reality, the door could only be opened and closed from the outside. Without looking back, I dashed into the woods. The snow piled up with every step, making my movements difficult, but the adrenaline kept me going. The only good thing about it was that the icy cold numbed the pain, and along with the adrenaline kept me on my feet. As I ran through the snowy forest, I heard James's screams echoing in the distance, rabid and full of fury. I didn't know how the hell he had made it out of the basement. I assumed there was some other way to open the door, or an exit that only he knew about. I knew that running was my only option. My heart leapt when, in the distance, I saw a small abandoned cabin, and I headed towards it without hesitation, hoping to find something I could use to defend myself or someone to help me deal with the monster that was following me. When I arrived, I didn't know if James had seen me enter, but I knew I had to act quickly. The cabin was empty, and as I hid, I saw him through a crack in the wall. He was desperate. His prey had escaped, and that made him more dangerous. I could tell that one of his eyes was completely closed and bleeding, so he must have been a bit disoriented without being able to see very well. I had to stay calm. It was my only hope, especially when James came into the cabin. It wasn't too hard to imagine I was there after all. There weren't too many places to go. With my heart pounding, I grabbed an old piece of iron pipe I had found on the floor and hid behind the kitchen door. James was not long in coming in, and when he leaned over to look behind the stove, without hesitation, I lifted the pipe and slammed it on his head with all my might. He fell to the ground, apparently passed out, but I didn't wait to see if he would react. I knew this was my only chance to escape, so with a second blow, this time to his face, his body shuddered to the ground, and wasting no time, I dropped the pipe and ran out of the cabin into the woods as fast as I could. I didn't know how far I had run or how much time had passed, but finally I saw lights in the distance. I had reached a small village, and without wasting a second, I started shouting for help. Immediately, several of the locals came out, most of them opening their eyes wide when they saw me. I didn't know how bad I was until I looked at my reflection in the window of a house. My eyes were bruised and swollen. I was covered in blood from head to toe and replete with open wounds. My clothes were a mess, and unusually, it was only then that I realized I was barefoot and had been running around in the snow like that all that time. Fortunately, probably from the heat of the adrenaline, my feet were intact, without any symptoms of frostbite. The locals assisted me, and immediately someone called the police. I told the officers everything that had happened, but they took their time to go investigate, and when they finally arrived, they found no one. But they did find the bodies, which thanks to the cold were still well preserved. They were 3 young women that they were unable to identify. I would like to say that I received help or they took me to some shelter or something, but it wasn't like that. The truth is that I spent weeks wandering the streets, homeless, without family or anyone to trust, always feeling the fear that James would find me again. However, little by little, I began to rebuild my life. One day I climbed into the back of the van of a group of locals going to the nearest town, which was about 5 hours away. Until then, I didn't know how remote that place was, and now I saw that it was practically in the middle of nowhere. Once in town, I found shelter in a hostel and then got a job, went back to school and formed new friendships. 2 decades passed before I heard from James again. He had been arrested for other crimes. When I finally saw him again, it was in a police report, and I knew then that he had killed many women, that he had gone on with his life of terror, but something in me felt at peace. I also saw that he was one-eyed, which to some extent gave me satisfaction. That monster died in 2016, and although it may sound strange, for the first time I felt liberated. Not just because of justice, but because I could cross the street without fear of running into him someday. My story is not perfect, but I now have the opportunity to live without looking back. I am a wife and mother of 2 now, and while I am relieved to know that this monster is no longer a danger, I am fully aware that there are many more like him loose in the world, and every time I think about it, a shiver runs through me. I only hope that God gives me life to stand by my children and protect them from that and all kinds of predators. All was still at the edge of the cliff, the wind howling and whipping my face with its relentless cold. The waves were crashing against the rocks, and each blow echoed in my heart full of anguish. How had I gotten here, caught between betrayals, lies, and deceit, all disguised as family loyalty? It had all begun in the tumultuous year 2020, a period already marred by the chaos and uncertainty of the pandemic. My mother, a woman whose bitterness seemed to grow with each passing day, had begun her relentless campaign. Her goal was clear. She wanted to take over the shares of the family corporation that had belonged to my father. The rules were strict. Only direct descendants could own them, but that didn't stop my mother, who believed she deserved everything for having borne what she considered my grandparents' burden. One night she confronted me with a question that would seal our family fate. Will you give me your shares when your father passes away? Her eyes, sharp and calculating, were filled with terrifying determination. Your sister has already said yes. What about you? His question stung deeply, but despite the pressure, I stood my ground. No, I won't, I replied firmly, defying her anger. The anger in his gaze was undisguisable, but I was not intimidated. I trusted my father. I watched him listen quietly, with the oxygen mask on his face and a worried expression. Don't worry about it, he finally said. I'll take care of the situation. That quietness was short-lived, however. A week later, my mother approached me with a triumphant smile and a piece of paper in her hand. It was a document, an amendment signed by my father and uncle granting her the shares. Your dad asked me not to show this to you, she stated, her voice brimming with satisfaction. But I thought you should know. My heart sank. I hoped there was a way to prove it was a forgery, a desperate attempt to manipulate me. But when I asked my uncle, the betrayal was confirmed. He had signed too. At that moment, I was not only hurt by the actions, but by the bitter reality of who was really the woman who was supposed to love and protect me. My mother, who should be my support, my refuge, had decided to become a predator. dismantling our family for her own benefit. I decided to move away from her and my sister, seeking respite, hoping that distance would bring clarity. However, the anger remained, constant as a shadow I could not avoid. I dedicated myself to research, digging deeply into any legal avenue that might reverse the situation, any loophole that would allow me to regain what had been taken from me. One night I found myself in our old family cabin, a place filled with memories. As I was going through boxes full of documents looking for something that might help me, I stumbled upon an old diary. It was my mother's, and as I opened it, words poured from the pages, filled with venom. Her entries detailed her resentment toward my father, my grandparents, and even us children. But one entry in particular stood out among all the others. It was from 2006, the year my sister was born. She spoke of her longing to escape, how she had planned to leave my father, but had stayed for the sake of appearances and the family's financial stability. At that moment, I felt a mixture of emotions overwhelm me: anger, betrayal, and oddly enough, a dark, unsettling satisfaction. My mother had feigned a life of happiness, but there was an undercurrent of resentment I had never imagined. That revelation made me realize how far she had gone in her quest for power and control. She was willing to destroy our lives for a measly handful of shares and a space in the family legacy. As I read, I realized that I could no longer allow her poison to consume us any further. The wind was still blowing hard on the cliff, as if the world itself was also rebelling against the injustices. I knew I could not turn back, that I had to face the reality of what had happened and fight for my future. My mother's betrayal had scarred me, but it had also armed me with the determination to vindicate what was right. So in that place where the wind howled like an echo of my pain, I vowed that I would rise again with strength and confidence. I would never allow their destructive ambition to cut my life short. So the battle for shares was only the beginning, and though I knew the road would be difficult, I was ready to face whatever came. With the diary in hand, I understood that I now had to be strong not only for myself, but also for the memory of a father who had been disgraced. My mother was not only a manipulator, but a liar who had lived a double life and whom I finally had to confront. I waited patiently until the next family meeting, and when I arrived, I immediately sensed the tense atmosphere, thick with hidden secrets. I decided to corner my mother in the kitchen with the diary I had found clutched tightly in my hand. "What is this?" I asked, shoving the open page toward her face. Her eyes widened and then narrowed. "Where did you get that?" he hissed, trying to keep his cool. "It doesn't matter. You lied to all of us. You were going to leave Dad, but you stayed just for the money." She laughed with a cold, bitter sound. "And what do you think, that you're better than me? You're just like him, clinging to those stocks and the power they mean." His voice buzzed between anger and contempt. He was shaking with fury as he replied, "You didn't deserve them, you never did." Then he leaned closer and in a low whisper said, "Maybe not, but they're mine now and there's nothing you can do about it." And with that last statement, he turned to leave. It was then that I noticed a special gleam in his eyes, the same one I had seen when he showed me the document that gave him the shares. The truth struck me like a bolt of lightning. He had planned all this, not only to keep the shares, but to destroy me and confront my father. I couldn't let her win. I had to find a way to expose her and reveal to the world who she really was. I spent the next few months gathering evidence, digging deep into her past, her finances, and her connections. The deeper I dug, the darker the picture became. My mother was not just a resentful woman. They were involved in illegal activities, using the family corporation as a front. I decided to go to the authorities, hoping they would take action. But the process was slow and she always seemed to be one step ahead. She was aware of my attempts and counterattacked fiercely. She spread rumors and turned my family and friends against me, and even tried to frame me in an embezzlement case. Everything I had accomplished seemed to fade away. One night I found myself back on the edge of the cliff. The waves crashed against the rocks as I held a bottle of whiskey, feeling a strange peace and resignation to my fate. But then I thought of my father, my sister, and even my grandparents. They deserved so much better than my mother's shadow. I couldn't allow her poison to spread any further, so I decided to make one last call to a journalist friend, handing him all the evidence I had accumulated. Every dark secret I had uncovered was my last act of defiance. When the story broke, the consequences were immediate. My mother was arrested, the corporation was under investigation, and the stock was frozen. However, the damage had already been done. Our family had been shattered. Trust had been destroyed beyond repair. Was it really worth it? With that question in mind, I stood once again on the cliff, looking out over the tumultuous sea, feeling the weight of my decisions. I had been victorious, but at a heartbreaking cost. The victory felt empty, the future was uncertain, and in the end I walked away, leaving that past behind, aware that some scars never heal and some betrayals are never forgiven. Hi, my name is Gina, and this incident happened about 7 years ago. It's a story I rarely share with anyone. In fact, I think this is about the second or third time I've talked about it. Most of the time when I tell it, people are uncomfortable or make well-meaning comments about what I should have done, not understanding how the mind really works in absolute panic situations. That said, here's my story. I was living in a cozy apartment in bustling downtown Nashville where I worked as a radiology technician. I returned from work at the usual time, around 5:30 p.m., and upon opening the door and walking in, I left my phone, wallet, and keys on the kitchen island, and almost immediately began running some errands at home. Raised in a small town, the habit of not locking the door during the day was so ingrained in me I didn't even consider it. My husband would be back soon, so I didn't think about it. I had never forgotten to lock the door in 6 years, until this fateful day. I went through to the bathroom and then entered my spacious walk-in closet, beginning to hang up the clothes I had left lying around before I left, when suddenly, the front door burst open. At first I smiled in surprise, thought my husband had arrived a little early and called out cheerfully, "Hi, honey." But I was greeted only by an eerie silence, and slowly, an uneasy feeling began to creep up my back. I tried to shake off that feeling, thinking that maybe he just hadn't heard me. However, when I stepped out into the living room, what I found chilled my blood. Standing on the other side of the kitchen island was a complete stranger. A man who looked to be about 50 years old, just staring at me. No ski mask, no gun. Just a guy standing there. With my heart in my throat, I thought maybe the man had gotten the apartment mixed up and would apologize before leaving. But as I kept looking at him, I realized I couldn't just stand there paralyzed. I knew I had to act. At that moment, I straightened my posture and puffed out my chest in an attempt to look more threatening. Although, let's be honest, it was very difficult to do so, being a thin and petite woman as I am. But with a strong and determined voice, I told him to go away, that he had no business being there. But he ignored me completely. It was almost as if she hadn't spoken at all. Then he began to collect my belongings. My phone, my keys, my wallet, methodically putting them in his own pockets. It was at that moment that I understood that this person was truly dangerous. Up until that moment, I had been naive, believing that this could all be a misunderstanding. But with this new reality looming in my head, fear and despair began to invade me. Without thinking, I lunged toward the only device that could help me, my computer. Drawing it toward me meant getting a little closer, but I still maintained a distance of 12 to 15 feet from the intruder. So I calculated that I could grab the device and run away before he could reach me, and so I did. As I picked up the computer, I saw him move in his direction, and as I turned to flee, I saw the man start to move after me very quickly. So I did the first thing that came to my mind. I ran towards the bathroom, as it was the only place where I could hide, closing 2 doors between us. One from the bathroom and the other was the closet door. I made sure to quickly close both doors, listening as he tried to struggle with the first one. In desperation, I opened my computer and in a panic logged into Facebook Messenger, sending multiple messages to my husband, begging him to call 911 and explain that there was an intruder in our home. I received a response from him within minutes, much to my relief, and he reassured me that an operator was on the line and that he would be heading home as soon as he could. He told me to try to stay safe in the bathroom and wait for help to arrive, and of course I listened. Not that you had much choice either. I waited there, and every second felt like an eternity, until I saw the bathroom door slowly open and the intruder enter the room. This one moved to the closet and started trying to open that door as well. Terror enveloped me as I waited for the police to arrive. But this is where people usually start offering me advice on what I should have done. What I can tell you is that I was paralyzed in those moments, overwhelmed with fear and shock. I don't know why, but I didn't scream or cry. I didn't reach for a weapon in that dark closet. I didn't try to hold the door or keep it shut. I just knelt down and expected the worst, because in that instant, death seemed imminent. People often argue that living in an apartment, if I had screamed, someone would have heard and come to my aid. They think there must have been something heavy enough in my closet to use as a defense. I even thought about how my laptop could do damage if I decided to throw it. But why didn't I do anything? The truth is, I don't have an answer for that. Miraculously, however, the closet door remained closed, and through the wood I heard the intruder's frustrated footsteps as he returned to the living room. I heard the sound of things breaking, bottles crashing, and drawers and cabinets opening and being emptied. But I continued to sit in the closet, silently crying and waiting for the inevitable, feeling death approaching. I felt selfish for what I was doing, so I decided to send a message to my mother, who lived more than 15 hours away by car. I told her what was happening. I also desperately wanted comfort and wanted to tell her how much I loved her. I am not an attention seeker, but I can imagine the fear and helplessness she felt knowing her daughter was in danger, and that there was nothing she could do to help me. She responded quickly, begging me to stay in touch, so I promised her I would do so while I could, and also asked her to convey to my siblings that I loved them, and to help my husband cope with whatever happened if things went wrong. Suddenly, the intruder returned and began fiddling with the closet door again, mumbling incoherent words that I couldn't make out. In a corner of my mind, I held out hope that the police would get to the apartment before my husband did, because I didn't want him to be the one to find me in whatever way this invader left me. Then I heard the front door open once again, and this time it was my husband yelling for me. In a flurry, the intruder moved into the kitchen, and I opened the closet door and ran out to him. My husband was on the floor, pinned down by the stranger, who continued to mumble and occasionally yell, but without offering much resistance. All of this became a blur in my mind as the room spun and filled with fear, especially for my husband. But at that instant, the police finally arrived at the apartment. It took them approximately 25 minutes, which still leaves me stunned. I know that in frightening situations, time seems to slide slowly, but in this case, I thought less time had elapsed than it actually was. From the time my husband dialed 911 until the officers came in, it was an excruciating 25 minutes. I don't mean to criticize anyone, but 25 minutes seems like an extremely long time for a response in a home invasion case. Literally anything could have happened to me during that time. It would have taken the intruder only a few minutes to get to me and murder me if he had wanted to, and then this story would have been very different. After the police recovered my belongings from the intruder and removed him from my apartment, I was in a daze. I went through the arduous process of putting together a police report telling them everything that had happened. One of the officers, in an attempt to be helpful, commented that I should keep the doors locked at all times. And at the time, I felt that his words were insensitive, as if he was somehow blaming me for what had happened. However, I accepted that her advice came from experience. Perhaps she had seen similar situations with other women before. In less than 30 minutes, the most terrifying incident of my life had come to an end. But the fear, the violation of my space, and the anxiety would be with me for years to come. If this had happened to me once, I couldn't help but think it could happen again. If something similar has happened to you and you struggle with the aftermath, the sleepless nights, The noises that keep you awake, the fear of future break-ins, or the constant nightmares. I want to tell you that you are not alone in that, and it took me a long time to recover from this incident. Luckily, this never happened again, but the aftermath remained for months. And even today, I usually come home a little nervous and close all the doors and windows immediately. It's the first thing I do when I enter. I've never been one of those people who pry into other people's lives. I've never been the type to complain about the neighbor's noise or gossip about other people's bad decisions. In fact, I used to be the noisy neighbor myself, to tell the truth. However, the sounds coming from my neighbor Martin's house became impossible to ignore. Eventually, what I'm about to relate here gave me reason to worry. Martin's house was no different from others in the neighborhood. It was modest, well-kept, and there was nothing strange at first glance. Martin, a man in his 60s, always seemed neat and reserved. He had never given me any reason to be suspicious of him, although I must admit that there was always something peculiar about his manner. When the noises started, they were just small details that I initially ignored. A full shopping cart, the basement light on after hours, and those subtle knocks, as if someone had been trapped in there for weeks. I tried to convince myself that maybe Martin was watching movies or listening to music. There were too many plausible explanations, and it was hard to think that my neighbor could be dangerous. However, one night, those noises became very disturbing, and it was evident that something was wrong in his house. It was no longer just banging, things being moved, and lights being turned on at inappropriate hours. But on a few occasions, I could have sworn I heard muffled screams and even scratching. Things were getting a little suspicious and creepy, so I could no longer ignore it. I had to act. I considered calling the police, but I didn't think they could do much. Most likely, they would simply go to his house, tell him that a neighbor reported him for noise, which would only alert Martin. And that idea terrified me, because even if I wanted to think I was just exaggerating, something inside me told me that something dark was going on at my neighbor's house. That's why I needed to investigate on my own, so I prepared for it. The next day, everything went on like any other day. Martin went out early, got in his car, and drove off. I watched out the window until his car disappeared from my sight, and then I decided it was time to act. I crossed the garden, heading for his house, and as I arrived, I felt the need to be cautious. I couldn't just walk in, that would raise suspicion. However, there was a small back door that I rarely used, as if I wanted to keep it a secret, and to my surprise, the door was open. Upon entering, the interior was as ordinary as I remembered. The kitchen was spotless and everything looked in its place. But suddenly, a sound caught my attention. A soft but distinct moaning came from the basement. When I opened the door leading to the stairs, a musty smell hit me hard, so I went down cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I turned on the light, but what I saw there completely paralyzed me. The room had cold concrete walls, and in the center I found a cage. Inside, there was an emaciated, pale-skinned woman surrounded by 6 children who appeared to be equally malnourished and terrified. My mind was slow to process what I was witnessing. The woman looked up and looked at me, confused and frightened. I wanted to approach her, but the shock left me immobile. I could not believe what I was seeing. I truly believed that my paranoia had led me to think the worst, but this was horrible and real. I learned to my horror that my neighbor was holding an entire family captive. I was on the verge of a mental breakdown, but I knew I had to leave before he returned. As I approached the cage, the woman grabbed my arm with surprising strength, almost desperate. "Please get us out of here," she pleaded. My heart raced and I began to search for something I could use to open the cage. My hands were shaking as I searched the room, but there were no tools, nothing that could help me. In the middle of my search, I heard a noise upstairs and heard the front door open with an unsettling creak. Martin had returned. Had I forgotten something I should have left behind? I could feel the pressure of time pressing and didn't have much room to maneuver. The only option was to hide, so I slipped behind some stacked boxes. hoping their dark contents would camouflage me. Martin's footsteps echoed nearby, moving slowly and calculatedly, as if he enjoyed the game of stalking his prey. He descended the staircase, and as I looked around, I realized I had made a big mistake. The light was not on when I entered, and that is something I had surely already noticed, and was surely on alert. Suddenly, Martin began to inspect the basement closely, alert, looking for any sign of intrusion. The boxes were too exposed, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered me. But just when I thought all was lost, the woman screamed. The echo of her desperation filled the small basement, and although it horrified me, it also distracted Martin for a moment. In that instant, I saw him advance towards the cage, and his expression was one of restrained fury. Without a word, he began to beat the woman savagely while the terrified children cried but remained motionless, as if they had learned that any movement could make things worse. I was completely horrified, but I took advantage of that distraction and ran for the stairs. Martin immediately turned around, and like a predator sensing the proximity of its prey, turned to where I was. "What are you doing here?" he shouted at me in a deep and threatening voice, but I did not respond. I simply ran upstairs, out of the basement, and reached the kitchen door. But just as I was about to cross the threshold, I felt his hand grabbing my shirt, pulling me back. With monstrous force, he pushed me against the wall, the impact sending my head crashing against the plaster. "I knew you were a meddler," he sneered. "You think I didn't realize how much you were watching me?" He grabbed me by the collar, dragging me away with ease. I tried to grab onto anything in the kitchen, kicking frantically in an attempt to free myself, but only managed to grab a small bottle. It wasn't a knife or anything that could serve as a weapon, just a bottle of orange soda. And as I crawled down, I felt panic wash over me. Martin threw me to the basement floor with force. I rolled down the stairs, hitting myself with each step, while he calmly descended, as if it was all part of a plan. I looked at the bottle, still in my hands, and a small glimmer of hope shone in my mind. As he approached me, ready to hurt me, I grabbed the bottle, and with what energy I had left, I threw the acidic liquid in his face. His scream of pain echoed like a terrifying echo in the basement as he recoiled, covering his eyes. Then I seized the opportunity and rammed him with all my might. He began to stagger and crashed against the cage where the woman was, and she, with a courage I had not expected, bit him on the neck, tearing off a piece of his flesh. A new scream of pain came out of her mouth and echoed throughout the place, mixing with mine by instinct. The confusion gave me the perfect moment to crawl towards the stairs. As I exited the house, I felt a mixture of relief and terror coursing through every part of my body as I ran away. I ran full speed to my house, and when I got there, I slammed the door hard. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely find the lock, but there was no time for fear, so as soon as I got over the door, I quickly called 911. Fortunately, the patrol cars arrived much faster than I expected, and within minutes I watched as they lined up on the street and a group of officers sped off in the direction of my neighbor's house. From the window, I watched the officers enter, armed and ready, and a tense silence hung in the air before the shouting began. The faces of the police officers evidenced revulsion and disbelief as they discovered what was in the basement. They quickly led Martin away, handcuffed and covered in blood. Later, I would learn that this story was not just about a kidnapper. The woman I had found was not a stranger, but her own daughter, and all the children were her descendants. What I had witnessed was a grim chapter in his life, a nightmare that had lasted far too long. I frequently reflect on whether I should have acted sooner, but I quickly dismiss those thoughts. I know I did the right thing in dealing with the situation. I hope I'm wrong, but I find it hard to imagine this woman and her children being able to rebuild their lives after what they experienced with Martin. However, at least now they have a chance to start being free. Now, with the help of the authorities, they can begin the process of healing and envision a different future. It was an ordinary day in the neighborhood. The monotony was in the air, like the smell of fritanga coming from the houses. Every morning I woke up with the uncertainty of what the day would bring. I was 17 years old and life seemed like a video game in which I always lost. That is, school made no sense to me because I was always the worst student, and plans for the future sounded absurd. My parents didn't pay the slightest attention to me. It was as if I was a nuisance. Not that I want to justify my actions, but all that led me to look for a place to belong. A group that would accept me, so I made a group of friends who were not exactly the most recommendable. Actually, they were a bunch of kids who were not afraid to get into trouble. At first, we just hung out to smoke and listen to music, but little by little, things got more serious. One of them, the oldest of the group, was a guy who called himself El Lobo. He was charismatic and had a way of talking that got you. I remember the first time he looked me in the eye and told me I could always count on him. The way he moved, how he laughed without a care in the world, made me want to be like him. At the time, I didn't realize how deep I was digging my own grave, because the idea of belonging to a gang kept creeping into my head like a line in a catchy song. I promised myself I would never do anything serious. I just wanted to feel like my life counted for something. Weeks passed and the group became my refuge, and there, between jokes and laughter, I felt alive. The first time I did something criminal was a simple fight in the street. There was a rival group that was giving us dirty looks, and without thinking, we jumped into action. The adrenaline made me feel powerful. It was as if at that moment all my problems disappeared, but after that fight, something changed. El Lobo started pushing me to do more dangerous things that made me doubt even myself. Stealing, extorting, even selling substances, you know. We were all doing what we had to do to earn respect. On a cold October night, the wolf decided it was time to go one step further. "Let's send a message," he said. And I, being stupid, just nodded. The plan was simple. Go into a rival neighborhood and do some banditry. Let them know they couldn't fuck with us. But what started out as an exciting game turned into a nightmare. When we arrived, the situation got out of control, and suddenly, we were surrounded, and of course the fight was not long in coming, only this time things escalated. I remember the sound of sirens blaring in the distance, the air thick with the smell of fear, and in the midst of the chaos, everything became a blur. I could only think of not letting the wolf look at me with disappointment. Then, like a bloody action hero, I pulled out a knife I had been carrying in the hope of looking tougher. I didn't even know how to use it, but I felt invincible. Everything in my head was noise, the voices, the screams, and then a gunshot rang out. Time stopped. I looked around and saw a friend fall to the ground screaming. It was then that real terror came over me. We weren't just fighting for respect, we were gambling with our lives. On an instinctive impulse, I ran for my life as I heard the gunshots, but realized I didn't know where the hell I was going. The streets seemed like mazes. The sirens sounded closer and closer, and my heart was pounding. In the darkness, I lost all sense of time. Some part of me wanted to give up, but another part kept going until finally, on a corner, I ran into two guys from the rival gang. They were looking at me with that death stare, and I saw one of them pull out a gun. In that instant, I understood what it really meant to be in a gang. It wasn't just fun and adventure, it was a death sentence. Then, as if fate was on my side, a car passed by and the guys got distracted, and I took advantage of that split second and ran as if the devil himself was on my heels. When I got to my house, more dead than alive, I lay on the floor, feeling every single one of my decisions weighing on my chest. There I was, the boy who had wanted to be part of something bigger, and all I had succeeded in doing was putting my life at risk. My friends lost all meaning. Many were caught, others ran away, others died, and I, a scared kid, discovered that gangs are not family. They are traps, death traps. I learned my lesson the hard way. Sometimes the paths we choose lead us into an abyss from which it is difficult to escape. Since that night, I decided to walk away from it all, looking for a way out that I didn't even know existed. Sometimes reconnecting with the essentials of life feels scarier than any dark street. But the truth is, that's how my horror story ended. with a kid who got lucky but found himself again, away from the shadow of the wolf and the gangs. We've all had a best friend at one time or another. Mine was Alfred. Ever since he moved in next door when we were both 10 years old, we became inseparable. Before that, I used to stay at home, stuck in my video games, and used to go out alone for a game of basketball with my dad in the driveway, where we had a small court. But since Alfred came to the neighborhood, we spent all our time together, and not only us, our families also became close. We even celebrated holidays together, as if we were one big family. However, as we got older, things started to change. Don't get me wrong, we were still friends, but we started to meet more people, especially when we entered high school, where a dark event happened that buried our friendship forever, and that's what I'm going to tell you today. One day at school, as I was standing by my locker, I was approached by the captain of the basketball team, Trevor. Alfred was standing next to me, and the kid said, "Hey, you're Rob, right?" He stretched out his hand to shake, and I responded, "Yeah, that's me," as I shook his hand. Then he continued, "I saw you shooting baskets in the gym during recess. You're really good, bro. We have a spot on our team. Do you want to try out?" My jaw dropped. I never thought I could be a part of the basketball team. But of course I wanted to try out. I said yes, and as he walked away, I saw Alfred's face. He didn't look too happy, to say the least. I knew those feelings of insecurity he got from watching athletes, but I didn't care. I loved playing basketball. Later that afternoon, I was in the gym, ready for tryouts, with Alfred by my side, almost as if he had to protect me from those beasts, as we used to call them. All the other guys on the team were practicing, and from the huge grin on my face, I knew Alfred didn't entirely like the idea. "Are you sure about this?" he asked me. "Look at the state they're in. You only have to see them crashing into each other to realize they're missing a set of nuts on more than one," he said as he nudged me. But instead of responding, I advanced towards Trevor, the captain, who seemed to be enjoying the moment. "Hey, you made it. And you brought your friend," he said, looking at Alfred, who was making himself small in the corner. "Yeah, sure, he's not much of a sports fan, but he's a cool guy," I replied. Then I disappeared onto the court, throwing and passing the ball. The coach seemed impressed, and that boosted my morale, and when I made a three-pointer from almost half court, everyone went crazy. It was like I was in a movie, feeling like they had finally seen the real me. After practice, Trevor came up to me. "Hey, Rob, coach wants to talk to you," he said, patting me on the shoulder, and his smile told me it would be good news. So I turned around and there he was, Coach, jersey in hand. "Congratulations, kid. You're part of the team now," he said, before shaking my hand. I couldn't believe it. I was on the team. It was like having realized a lifelong dream. However, the excitement didn't last long. Over time, as I celebrated my new feat, I noticed how Alfred became more and more distant from me, and our friendship seemed to grow colder. It was inevitable. Practices took time, and naturally I began to spend more time with my teammates and less with him. I worried that he would be hurt by it, but I thought he would understand. This was for my sake, for my future, and if he really appreciated me, he should be happy for me, as I would be for him. However, things only got worse. The mocking comments from some of the team members about the way he was began to take a toll on him, and that distance became a chasm. Every time I tried to pull him closer, he would pull away further, pretending he didn't care, but I knew he did. In the end, the friendship we had built for so many years faded, and what started as a dream became a nightmare. where laughter turned into awkward silences and complicity into reproachful glances. That connection we had was gone, and I realized that fame often takes you away from those who really matter. That afternoon, as I watched my classmates in the gym, I noticed Alfred in a corner, arms crossed and frowning. I walked over and asked him what was wrong, expecting him to say something positive about my new team jersey, but instead, he just told me he wanted to get out of there. He looked pretty upset, but I figured he just needed to clear his head, so I didn't want to push him. I just started bombarding him with questions, but in a joking tone like we always did. "What's up? Why so embarrassed? Loosen up a bit, buddy." But every time I insisted, he seemed to get more frustrated. Finally, I offered to spend the afternoon at my house playing video games, hoping it would cheer him up. "I need some me time," he replied, and I didn't know what that meant, so I just nodded. The next day, as we were leaving to meet at school, to my surprise, Alfred called early. "Hey, do you want a ride?" he asked. He had borrowed his mom's car, and of course, I said yes. Fortunately, on the way there, he looked more relaxed, but everything changed as soon as we pulled into the parking lot, and he saw Trevor. There, his face got serious again. "What's wrong with you all?" I asked him. Why, I saw that he didn't want to get out of the car, and he replied dryly, "Nothing. I'm just going to stay for a while." That was just the first sign that something was wrong, but as the days went by, it started to get weirder. Every time he saw me talking to Trevor, there was a huge amount of anger building up, and his bad feeling was very evident. But one day, the situation exploded. We were in the hallway by my locker, and Trevor came up to me. "Hey, Rob, I'm having a birthday party tomorrow at my house. Are you coming?" he asked. "Sure, I'll be there," I replied. I looked at Alfred, and to my surprise, Trevor told him that he could join too. It was at that moment that Alfred lost control. "Do you think I'm a charity case? Who do you think you are? The king of jocks?" he shouted in Trevor's face, and as you can imagine, he didn't keep quiet. He didn't like being told that, and even less loudly. So with a shove, he made Alfred fall to the ground, and everyone started laughing at him. Then I saw how the rage went up his face. He turned red as a tomato, but I couldn't do anything. There was no way he was going to stand up to Trevor, so in the end he just grabbed his backpack and left. I tried to call him, but his phone was off, and I assumed he had simply decided to go home. I didn't talk to him for the rest of the day. And that was weird because usually we'd fight over something silly. But after a while we'd be talking to each other like it was nothing. This time, however, it was different. The feeling that something was falling apart between us bothered me, but I didn't know what to do about it. That night, while I was in my room, I received a text message from Alfred. He was telling me to go to the city park, a place that was somewhat removed from where we lived. It was an old playground that had once been great, but now it was desolate. The structures were old, dismantled, and the whole place had an eerie vibe. So I asked him what was going on, but he didn't respond. I just wanted him to go check it out. In about 10 minutes, I got to the park, and there wasn't a soul in sight. I called his name, and all of a sudden I heard his phone ring. So I looked around, and in the distance, under a big tree, was him. "Hey, what's up, man?" I asked him as I approached. "Come, I want to show you something," he said in a weird tone, but when I got closer, his face chilled my blood. He looked pale and sick, with bloodshot eyes and deep dark circles under his eyes. In his hand he held a knife, and at the sight of it, I froze. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, feeling increasingly anxious. Suddenly he pulled something out from behind a bush and my heart stopped. It was Trevor, tied up, his face full of blood and struggling to breathe. "Alfred, what are you doing?" I shouted as I tried to run to Trevor to help him, but Alfred stopped me, pointing a knife at me. "Look, "You're wearing that basketball jacket you love so much," he said. "Take it off," he ordered, and I could only do as he said. "I always thought you wouldn't sell out for a little fame. I really thought you were better, but I was wrong. You're just a brainless bag of muscle, just like these beasts," he sneered. But before he could answer her, he grabbed Trevor by the hair, exposing his neck and placing the edge of the knife against his skin. "Stop! You're crazy!" I yelled at him. "This is what happens when you underestimate me, Rob. Take this as a lesson," he said as he began to press the knife to Trevor's neck. I was totally horrified. I would never have expected anything like this from Alfred, but I knew he wasn't in his right mind. It was obvious he had consumed something. His appearance said it all, but I couldn't stand idly by, so with an adrenaline rush, I jumped towards him to stop him. We both fell to the ground and the knife flew to the side. I tried to keep Alfred immobilized while he screamed like crazy, but I had more strength. "Calm down, that's enough," I shouted at him. Slowly, he seemed to regain control of himself. Okay, let me go," he said in a calmer voice. So I let go and he ran off, disappearing into the darkness. Then I released Trevor, who was trembling with fear and fury. I wanted to run out after Alfred, but he was already gone, and when I tried to call him, his phone was off. I didn't even see him at school the next day, so after school, I decided to stop by his house. "Hi, Mrs. Connor. Do you know if Alfred is here? I haven't seen him," I asked his mom. No. He's in Florida with some relatives. He's going to be staying for a while," she said as she slammed the door in my face. That was the last I heard from Alfred. Soon after, his family moved out too, and now the house belongs to others. It's as if they were never there, and the memories of what happened are still floating in the air. I've always loved cold winter mornings. There's something about the frosty air that wakes you up in a unique way, like it clears your mind. I usually go for a run at dawn, when the streets are deserted and the world seems to be just for me. And that morning was no exception. At least that's what I thought when I put on my running shoes and left the house. The cold was intense that morning, and the fog clung to the streets, causing the streetlights to flicker faintly. Even though everything was shrouded in heavy silence, I loved the quiet. I started my jog, feeling the rhythm of my feet pounding the pavement, and my breath was turning into clouds of steam floating in front of me, as if they wanted to remind me that I was alive. Everything felt so peaceful. Empty streets, quiet houses, just me, the cold and the fog. After 10 minutes, I arrived at the park, which is normally full of life during the day, but was now completely deserted. My plan was to do 3 laps around it before heading home so I wouldn't be left out in the cold. The first lap was perfect, but as I entered the second, I started to feel strange. It wasn't immediate. Rather, an uneasy feeling gradually took hold of me, as if the air had become thicker as I walked. At one point, the silence became almost distressing, and I began to look over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see someone behind me. But every time I turned my head, I found only fog. Thick, impenetrable fog. By the time I started my third turn, the discomfort had grown. My skin was bristling, and I could feel my heart pounding against my chest, and I could have sworn I heard soft footsteps behind me. I would stop and turn, but the park was still empty, just the rustle of leaves fluttering in the cold wind. "Stop being paranoid, Betsy," I said to myself. Probably the fog was getting on my nerves, or maybe I was just exhausted. Still, there was something in the air that told me something wasn't right. So I decided to take a break and sat down on a bench near the playground to catch my breath. As soon as I sat down, I heard a rustling sound, as if someone had stepped on dry leaves. Suddenly my heart stopped and I looked around, trying to find where that sound was coming from. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice sounding small and shaky. The answer was total silence. I scanned the fog, trying to focus my eyesight, but it was so thick, it was like looking through a curtain of dense smoke. Then suddenly I heard a faint laugh. A laugh that cut through the silence like a knife and sent chills down my spine. "Who's there?" I asked again, this time with more desperation, but I only got the same haunting laughter, coming closer. It was then that a figure emerged from the fog. It was a tall, gaunt woman with matted blonde hair falling in disheveled locks around her face. She wore a white nightgown, torn and stained a deep red that looked like blood. As I looked up, I noticed that her eyes were bloodshot, as red as if they were raw. They looked wild and full of tears, as if he had been crying non-stop. I froze instantly, unable to move a single muscle. My breath hitched, and when his lips curved into a smile, I knew it wasn't a good sign. That wasn't a friendly smile. That was a smile that causes you to have the urge to run and walk miles away. That's when I noticed that his hand was holding something. A finger. A finger cut off from someone else's hand, and from how big it looked, I knew it was a man's. I froze, my heart beating frantically. Blood was still dripping from that finger and staining the snow at his feet. Hanging from the finger was a wedding ring, and my stomach churned. I felt bile rise in my throat and instinctively took a step back, but stumbled as she let out a mocking laugh. "He's single now," she said, raising her finger in the air, with a tone of sarcasm quite evident, almost gleeful. Before I could process what she had said, however, her eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed in front of me. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind was blank, filled with terror and confusion. But then, somehow I managed to snap out of it. I reached blindly for my phone and managed to dial 911 with shaking hands. Fortunately, the police arrived within minutes, although to me it seemed like hours. They took the woman away, but not before telling me the truth. Her name was Estella, an artist who had killed her husband in his sleep because she thought he was cheating on her. Afterwards, she cut off his ring finger and wandered the streets for hours, while everyone was looking for her. Sometime later, I learned that Estella had been sent to a mental institution. She never spoke a word again after that night. From that day on, I never went out running that early again, and every time I see fog, I feel a knot in my stomach, remembering what I saw. In a quiet neighborhood like Calle Verde, one might think that life is rather monotonous and boring. The houses are almost identical: spacious gardens, two-car garages, and an almost oppressive calm that takes over the street at nightfall. People here live without fear, without worries about what might lurk in the dark, and that's just what makes it an ideal place for someone like me. I was hiding in the shadows, just inside the side entrance of a house I'd been watching for a couple of weeks. 22 Green Street. The guy who lived there was around 45 or 50 years old. A lonely guy who seemed stuck in his office routine, returning every night from a job that no one would want to envy, but which allowed him to live comfortably. His routine was always the same. He came home, parked his car, and disappeared behind closed doors, with no friends or family to keep him company. I checked the time on my cell phone, 12:42 p.m. The lights in the house had been off for a while and everything was quiet. The door creaked a little as I opened it and slid into the backyard. I chose this house on purpose. No dogs or alarms. The door was glass with a simple latch. It would be a piece of cake, so I put on my gloves, and within 2 minutes, I had gained entry. The house was silent and in complete darkness, but my eyes quickly got used to the gloom as I examined the place. To the left was the living room. In front was the kitchen and stairs leading to the second floor. I felt my heart pounding, but it was the adrenaline of invading someone else's space, where everything inside was mine for a few moments. I began to creep through the living room, enjoying the silence of the house. I would go upstairs, check the bedroom, and take whatever I could find valuable. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, something stopped me. At the end of the hallway was a door ajar, and a strange draft made me curious. It smelled of something strong, like disinfectant or bleach. I approached it, shining my flashlight into the darkness, and realized there was a basement. This filled me with curiosity, so I slowly walked down the stairs, the beam of light bouncing off the walls. Soon I reached a larger space, but it wasn't the kind of basement you'd expect to find in a normal house. The floor was polished concrete, and the walls were covered with a somewhat strange, unsettling foam. In the middle, there was a metal table surrounded by strange tools, scalpels, tweezers, and other instruments I couldn't identify. Along the walls were shelves of glass jars, each containing disturbing objects that sent a shiver through my body. What was this place? I approached, holding my breath, but when I saw what was inside those jars, my stomach flipped. Strands of hair, fingernails, teeth, and something else I couldn't recognize. However, as I recoiled in horror, my hand hit something on the table, causing it to fall to the floor with a clatter. I quickly bent down to pick it up, and trembling as I opened the object, I found something unexpected: a photo album. The first picture was of a young girl, barely 20 years old at most, smiling at the camera. As I turned the page, the laughter was gone. Her smile had faded, and her eyes were full of terror. Her hands now tied behind her back, and I couldn't help but feel an empty feeling in my stomach. But in the third photo, she was no longer alive. Her face was pale, catching the air with one last mute scream. Each page revealed a different victim, each more terrifying than the last. I slammed the album shut, unable to look at such an abomination any longer. Horror rose in my throat and my guts twisted. It was clear that what I had found was not only criminal, it was inhuman. Anxiety washed over me, and I realized that I had dug into something deeply dark, something I should never have touched. The house on Calle Verde was not a home. It was a hideout for the unimaginable, and I was about to become part of its sinister history. So, unable to contain my panic, I decided it was time to get out of there before something caught me in its trap. In that instant, I realized that I had screwed up, that I had stumbled upon nothing less than the home of a serial killer. How chillingly twisted. Before I could process it properly, however, an icy sound ran down my back, a soft but distinct moan coming from somewhere in the basement. I turned around with flashlight in hand, and there, on a metal chair, I saw a woman with her wrists and ankles bound and duct tape covering her mouth. Her eyes, big and terrified, looked at me with desperation, and I realized that she was alive. Without thinking, I ran to her and ripped the tape from her mouth. She inhaled shakily, tears began to fall down her cheeks, and she pleaded with me, "Please help me. He's coming back." A shiver ran through my body at that, and as I tried to undo the ropes that held her captive, my hand shook so intensely that I couldn't loosen the knots. She frantically made for the stairs, which increased my panic. We had no time. I could feel the terror spreading inside me. That's when we heard distant footsteps, followed by the hum of a television flickering in the darkness. Then, blurry images from hidden cameras throughout the house illuminated that TV in the basement. Every room, every window was monitored. As I watched in horror as the windows were closed with heavy metal panels, sealing themselves shut one by one. The front door closed with a dull thud and locked, as if someone had pressed a button. Everything was locked, as if it were a security bank. Panic squeezed my throat. I turned the flashlight in my hands just as I heard footsteps approaching down the stairs. My instincts screamed that I should escape, but there was no way out now. There was no place to hide. The only escape route was to go through, and even then, the house was sealed. Then, I saw him. It was the man with the creepy pictures. He stood in the doorway of the stairs, with a cool calmness and a twisted expression on his face, while his eyes fluctuated between the woman and me, as if weighing who to murder first. The guy was holding a huge, shiny knife in his hand, and suddenly said, "You shouldn't be here." He looked disappointed. Every fiber of my being told me I should run, but terror paralyzed me. I felt I had no escape. As he began to slowly descend the stairs, enjoying every moment, I searched for what I could to defend myself, and luckily, I found a metal bar. I held it up in front of me, and my heart thundered in my ears. "Get away from her," I shouted in a trembling voice. He smiled in a terrifying way, as if he enjoyed my fear. "You don't understand," he said in a nonchalant tone. "This is my house. You are the intruder here. You're supposed to attack me, that I'm the one who's supposed to say, 'Stay away.'" And then he burst out laughing. Before I could react, he lunged at me with the knife. I swung the bar with all my might, but he was too fast, and in an instant, his knife cut my arm. A sharp pain brought me to my knees, as blood began to pour from the wound and soaked the floor. With fear flooding my thoughts, I realized I wasn't going to make it out of there alive, and that truth hit me like a speeding train. He lunged again, snatching the bar from me and throwing it away, as I recoiled in terror, hitting the ground hard. The air was knocked out of my lungs at that instant, and I felt completely helpless as I watched him hold me down with his foot on my chest, while the knife glinted ominously in the gloom, focusing on my throat. It was the end. I could feel it. My thoughts revolved around how I had come so far, in a place where no one should be, and now I was at the mercy of a monster, with no way out and no hope. This couldn't be happening. Darkness was taking over my mind as his steady, disturbing gaze brought everything bad I had ever done in life back to haunt me in my final moments. Time seemed to stand still as I prepared for the worst, watching the knife descend. But just when I thought it was all over, the woman I had freed appeared. She was wounded and trembling, but alive. Then, with all her might, she raised the metal bar and with a piercing scream, slammed it into the back of the killer's head. The dull sound of metal against his skull echoed through the basement like thunder, and instantly he fell on top of me, unconscious, as the knife slipped from his hand. I managed to push him off me, gasping and my heart pounding as I tried to catch my breath. Despite the fear gnawing at my bones, we quickly secured the killer in the chair with some ropes we found nearby, making sure he couldn't move. I noticed that his head was bowed and blood was dripping from his wound, so we couldn't be confident. Even though he was out cold, the house was still sealed. The woman, who introduced herself as Samira and had Arab roots, knew how to disable the security system. She had been watching and learning, and within minutes, we heard a click, and the doors opened. We wasted no time. We just ran upstairs, emerging into the cool night air, The breeze hit me in the face like a slap in the face, and for the first time since I entered that nightmare, I felt like I could breathe again. My arm hurt like hell, but I didn't care. I had made it out of that demon house alive, and that was all that mattered. Once on the street, Samira, her hands shaking, pulled out the phone she took from the killer and started calling the police. I slumped on the sidewalk, looking up at the starry sky as a gentle rain began to fall, and its tiny drops danced over me. I was alive. I had survived that hell, but I was so close to not. Now sirens blared in the distance and I closed my eyes, silently grateful and wishing I was out of there before the police arrived. I realized how reckless I had been. I got carried away by greed and walked into a place where I shouldn't have. I felt that in a way I deserved the scare I had just gotten. I even think I needed it, because after that night, I knew I would never want to steal again. When I first got to college, my parents decided to buy me an old Toyota Corolla. It was a real mess, but it served its purpose and allowed me to come and go as I pleased. Over time, I learned to despise that car. It seemed to always have a problem. However, it helped me get a job as a pizza delivery man, so in the end, I couldn't complain about the gesture. One night, however, while I was making deliveries, everything went wrong. I had dropped off a bunch of pizzas at an apartment building and went back to my car. But just as I was about to get in, I noticed that the passenger side door was ajar. But before I could close it, a guy burst into the car, and when I looked up, I saw that he had a gun. In that instant, fear completely paralyzed me, and I knew this was not going to be an ordinary night. He pointed the gun right in my face, and without blinking an eye, ordered me, "Drive." That was all he said. My heart was pounding, and as my mind clouded with panic, I started the engine and began to drive. I was literally shaking in my seat, while in the rearview mirror, I saw two policemen running out of an alley. At that moment, I understood that they were probably chasing him, and I realized that the mess I was in might be even worse than I imagined, and the siren lights reflecting in the mirror confirmed my suspicions. At that moment, the guy raised his gun and told me that if I stopped the car, he would blow my head off, so I kept accelerating, heading for the suburbs as the cops followed us. I didn't hear them yelling anything over the loudspeakers, which made me think they were aware that I was a hostage, but that didn't give me a bit of peace of mind. The guy was yelling at me to be careful and increase my speed, but my car was a wreck. If I pushed the pedal to the metal, I was sure the engine could fly off the hood. I didn't know how many miles we had been going. My watch was broken, so I lost track of time. After quite a while, we started to see empty fields and areas, and that made my stress increase because the gas light was blinking, so I decided to tell him I needed to stop. At that point, the man looked at me as if he was truly about to shoot my brains out, but thank goodness he understood, albeit reluctantly. He knew we weren't going anywhere without gas, so we had to fill up. Finally, we arrived at a gas station, and I was ready to get out and fill up. However, the guy stopped me. The guy pulled out his cell phone and called 911 to tell the operator what was going on and warned her that if the police came near, he would kill me. At that point, I felt like a character trapped in a horror movie and wondered, how had I ended up like this? As he spoke, my mind raced on its own. What the hell was I gonna do? I knew I had to find a way out of this situation, but with him pointing that gun at me, I felt unable to do anything coherent. Desperation and fear filled the car, and my hands were sweating at the wheel. So I glanced sideways at the gas station, hoping that at any moment a miracle would appear, but that didn't happen. The reality was that I didn't know how long all this would go on. I just knew I had to hold on to hope, and that I had to think fast before everything turned even darker. So, As the guy continued to talk on the phone, I tried to stay calm and plan my next move. But the anguish wouldn't let me concentrate, and I knew that every second counted. Eventually, we arrived at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, and I was completely terrified. I asked the guy if he wanted me to get out to fill up the tank, but he took a look around and saw that those pumps make you pay first, so he said no. He couldn't let me out of the car yet. The cops were keeping a safe distance, watching the situation because they knew this guy could kill me at any moment. And I'm not going to lie, that thought crossed my mind the whole time. The cops were yelling through their loudspeakers, trying to calm him down. "Let the hostage go. We can resolve this without anyone getting hurt. Cooper, just surrender and you'll get help." I felt like a pawn in a chess game, always with the gun pointed at my head, and every time the guy raised the gun, I thought any second he was going to pull the trigger. Looking back, I think if he did, the cops would have gotten in the car and shot him. But that guy was so nervous and insecure that I could see him frantically trying to think of a way out. He couldn't get out of the car for the gas station attendant to open the pumps. They all scrambled between the counters as soon as they saw him. It was dangerous. He seemed convinced that if I tried to get out, he would immediately run to the cops, and he wasn't wrong. It was actually my #1 escape plan right away. So, he asked me how far it was to the next gas station if we stayed with what we had in the tank, and I told him about 2 miles at the most. The guy let out a deep sigh as if completely deflating. I realized I was lost, and this was coming to an end. Just then, I knew I could see that he was at his most dangerous. Honestly, I thought I was going to die. The thought of the guy shooting and getting into a shootout with the police filled me with dread. When I heard him mutter "fuck him" as he handled the gun, I got the feeling that it was all about to end. I felt a chill, and my heart was racing, so I closed my eyes, gripped the steering wheel with all my might, and waited for the end. A second later, I heard a rumble, and I couldn't believe it. I opened my eyes and saw some blood stains on the dashboard near the passenger seat, and as I turned around, my heart almost stopped. The guy had shot himself in the mouth. The entire interior of the car was splattered with blood and pieces of his skull everywhere. I got out of the car with my hands in the air and in complete shock. Almost immediately, my stomach twisted and I began to vomit, but with my hands up the whole time, as if I was going to give up. As I lay there in my own vomit, policemen were throwing themselves to the ground, ready to protect themselves in case I was a danger as well. Suddenly, I was so relieved. It sounded crazy, but at that moment I just wanted it all to be over. It was an indescribable relief. I was safe, or at least relatively safe compared to what had just happened. In the midst of the chaos, a euphoria I never knew I could feel came over me, and I began to laugh. It's funny how emotions affect everyone differently. I mean, everyone talks about how crying after experiencing something like that is normal, but in my case, I felt like a gladiator, as if I had won a fight against a giant but invisible enemy. I had survived the attack of a madman, and I really didn't think that would be the end of this story. So I was happy. I just wanted to get out of there and go back to my house, hug my parents, take a shower, and hug my bed until the next day. I definitely wouldn't wish such an experience on anyone, but I learned a big injury that day, that life is too unpredictable. I live on the outskirts of the city, in a house that is secluded enough that I can enjoy the quiet at its finest, but close enough that I don't feel completely alone. I moved here a few years ago looking for a change, especially after breaking up with my girlfriend. Usually the nights were very quiet, you know? That kind of quiet that makes you feel good and comforts your soul. There wasn't much to do either, and that was part of the charm of the place. One night, as I was on the couch watching a series, I felt relaxed and comfortable, with nothing to interrupt me. I had had a long day at work, and just as I was about to turn off the TV, I heard a thump. At first, I thought it was a branch blowing in the wind, which was not uncommon around here, so I decided to ignore it. But then, the knock was repeated, this time louder. I stood silent and attentive when I heard another thump. It was no longer just a coincidence, so I got up and walked over to the window, but I didn't see anything strange outside. I decided to check the security cameras I had installed just in case, and that's when something I didn't expect showed up. A guy was banging on my door and also kicking on the porch, as if he was in trouble. On the camera screen, his appearance was alarming. His clothes were torn and there was blood on his forehead. He looked disoriented and wasn't carrying anything that could be considered a weapon, which put me even more on alert. Instinct told me I had to help him. I couldn't just ignore him and leave him there, so I approached the door. But before opening it, I looked through the peephole. It was then that I realized that something was very wrong. The boy was breathing heavily, and his posture had changed drastically. He no longer looked scared. He looked rather determined, even aggressive. I stared through the hole, and the feeling of discomfort increased. Suddenly, he started banging on the door, but it wasn't like before. Now he was banging his body against the wood, as if he was trying to break it. I didn't understand what was going on with that boy, but I was certain that opening the door would be a big mistake. So I stepped back a little and shouted at him, "What do you want? I'm calling the police." But I got no answer. Just a low, guttural grunt that made me shiver. The boy banged on the door again, but this time with his head, really trying to get in. On that new attack, the sound of the wood creaked, and that made me panic. I couldn't wait any longer. I just picked up the phone and called the police, quickly explaining the situation as I continued to look through the peephole. The boy was there, moving frantically, and suddenly he collapsed on the ground in a strange way, as if he had lost control of his body, and that left me perplexed. For an instant I thought it was all over, that he had hurt himself enough to stop. But then I remembered that I had the windows open and a new jolt of panic swept through me. I ran through the house, closing each window as fast as I could, not wanting to risk him getting in. And when I finished securing them all, I went back to the door hoping the guy was gone. But he wasn't. He crashed back into the house, and this time with more force than before. The sound of the door creaking with such fury that I knew I wasn't going to take much more. Anxiety gripped me as I waited for whatever this man had in mind, and a sense of absolute terror began to envelop me as I braced myself for the worst. The knocking echoed loudly, more and more aggressively, as if the door couldn't resist the pressure, until it finally gave way. The guy came in like a whirlwind, ripping off his shirt and revealing his torso covered in strange symbols, weird marks and cuts on his skin that were still dripping. In his hand he held a small but sharp razor, and he walked towards me with an expression of desperation and barely keeping his balance. I tried to back away, but every step backward seemed to encourage him to come closer. I didn't really understand what he was planning, but his gaze was fixed, and it was getting more and more disturbing. Suddenly, the guy lunged towards me without a word, but with a quick movement, I managed to dodge him and he crashed into the wall, as if he had lost control in his run. But he didn't stop. He kept walking towards me and stood in the center of the room, raising the knife and preparing for another attack. Then I screamed very loudly and tried to stop him with words, but he didn't seem to hear me. It was very frightening. I had never been in such a situation before. His eyes were empty, as if he had nothing inside. But in that instant, something changed. The guy started to convulse, and in the middle of that spasm, his eyes acquired a terrifying intensity, filling with rage. Without warning, he dropped the knife and ran towards me, this time with more control and agility. He was no longer stumbling but moving like a wild animal, and before I could react, he tackled me to the ground. Then, with an indescribable fury, it began to claw at me, attacking me as if it wanted to disfigure me. Each scratch felt like deep cuts, and I didn't know how to defend myself. Then he grabbed me by the neck, and with his thumbs began to press on my eyes. The pressure was unbearable. I was suffering intensely, trying to get him off me, but I couldn't, and I was about to give up when suddenly I heard sirens. At that moment, the police arrived, and 2 officers rushed in, managing to peel the guy off me. But even handcuffed, the man was still struggling with irrational strength. "You don't understand. It will all be in vain. The blood must flow. Do it quickly before it's too late," he was saying between grunts. The guy spoke in a very strange tone as he tried to wriggle free. The policemen held him tightly, but he was still shouting. They even managed to pull him down with difficulty. The officers dragged him away, but their eyes never left me. He kept swearing that he wouldn't stop until there was blood. When they finally took him away, I lay on the ground, feeling every part of my body burning from the scratches and blows, unable to process what had just happened. The scene was surreal. The cops dragged him out, his screams fading as they shoved him into the police car. I was silent, trying to catch my breath and understand all that I had experienced. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the shattered door, trying to put my thoughts in order. The blood marks were still there, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see his face disfigured by anger and his hands trying to kill me. The police called me the next day. They informed me that they had arrested the guy and that he was still behaving erratically. He had attacked the guards and kept talking about how he had to make my blood run. They asked me if I knew him, but I told them I had never seen him before in my life. Sometimes I would even watch the security footage, trying to understand what had happened. In my last conversation with the police, they gave me an off-the-record tip. The guy was crazy and had escaped the attention of his family, who refused to take him to a psychiatric hospital. They ruled out that there was a rational attack, but I knew there was something to his madness. That force he used to attack me was frighteningly real. This man could be completely insane, but he was convinced he was possessed, and that was all it took to try to kill me. The idea that someone could break down like that and become such a danger left me cold, and the fear haunted me even after he was taken away. This happened a long time ago, before we were all glued to our cell phones. I was a young mom, just turned 30, and had taken my 2 little ones to the pediatrician, so I had to deal with them during the hour-long drive to the doctor's office. My kids were 2 and 3 at the time, and since we lived so far apart, the clinic had given us the last appointments of the day, which I was very grateful for. The doctor had moved his office to a sort of new building next to the freeway, and although it was in the middle of nowhere, it was a nice place compared to the old office near the hospital. When we arrived, I parked my black Jeep near the main entrance. There were only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot. Getting the kids out of their car seats was a challenge, but after a short wait, we saw the doctor. The consultation was quick, and after paying, we were ready to go home. By then, my Jeep was the only car left in the parking lot. I loaded the kids back into their seats for the long drive home, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. Just a strange clicking sound. I was very frustrated. I put the kids back down and knocked on the front door until the staff let us back in. Then I asked to use the phone to call a nearby garage and found one in the old phone book. The attendant who answered told me he would send someone, although it might take a while. I immediately gave him my location and returned to the Jeep. I rolled down the windows and put the children back in their seats. As we waited, I watched all the lights in the building go out, and the staff began to leave, one by one. I tried to entertain my children by finding snacks in the car and giving them a bottle of water, making sure they didn't get too hot. The receptionist had told me that help might take a while, so I wasn't surprised when a truck pulled into the empty lot. Soon, a man stepped out of the vehicle. He was a middle-aged guy, somewhat disheveled, but I thought that was normal for someone who works with cars. He smiled at me and nodded, then said he was going to lift the hood, so I sat in my car, waiting for him to give me instructions. But several minutes passed and I didn't know what he was doing, so I got a little frustrated. I just wanted him to check something simple and leave. After a good while of waiting, I decided to ask him what was wrong, and in a nonchalant voice, he replied, "Oh, it's just a loose wire. It's not the battery." As he continued to work, I couldn't see his face. I could only make out his hands moving furtively through the crack between the windshield and the raised hood. The wait became uncomfortable as I noticed he wasn't doing anything resembling fixing my car, and I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. The uneasy feeling grew, and I looked at the kids, who were still fiddling around as if nothing was wrong. Then, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that darkness was slowly starting to fall, but the guy was still stuck in my engine. I had a feeling he was just stretching out the time without doing anything. Several more minutes passed, and the guy was still concentrating on what he was doing. Suddenly, I noticed that he stood still and raised his head, looking back to where he was. I couldn't see his expression, but his posture and the way his hands were on the engine sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know if it was my imagination or if there was really something in his gaze, but my sixth sense was telling me that something wasn't right with this man. That's when I felt I had to do something, so I leaned out a little and called out to him again, asking him if everything was okay, but his response was blank, as if he wasn't even listening. I started to feel a knot in my stomach. It was a scene that didn't look promising, but when I was most uneasy about the situation, I suddenly heard a strange noise coming from him. The man kept his head down, but his body showed some shaking, as if he was experiencing some kind of tremor. The tension in the air became almost palpable. I wanted to get out of the Jeep and take my children to a safe place, but I could not leave them alone in the car. I looked around, hoping to see someone else in the parking lot, but it was deserted. Meanwhile, the man kept fiddling with the wires of the engine, and the atmosphere was getting stranger and stranger. The uncertainty terrified me, and I knew I had to act before the situation became even darker, because I really didn't know what this man's true intentions were. Suddenly, he asked me to get out of the car and come over to where he was to show me what he was doing, but at that point I was feeling very suspicious, so I just told him to let me know when he was ready and could turn the key. He insisted that it would only take a moment. Despite my growing distrust, I was about to get out, when suddenly, a truck pulled into the parking lot, and as it did, the guy slammed the hood of my Jeep shut, and without a word, ran to his truck and flew away. I froze, confused and a little anxious. Who was the new guy? I felt vulnerable, alone and completely trapped with my two little ones. I looked around and saw that there were no cars on the road, no houses or businesses nearby, and the daylight was fading fast. The feeling of loneliness increased, and it became clear to me that this new van, without any identification, was getting closer and closer to me. With some suspicion, I opened the car door again, and this time I was more nervous as I did so. The new guy introduced himself quickly. He was a man who seemed to match the one I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He called my name and apologized for being late. I then pointed to the van that was already going far away and told him that that guy over there was the one who had said he was going to help me. We both looked at each other in silence and then burst out laughing, but mine was more of a nervous laugh because I felt a knot in my stomach. With that, He pulled out some jumper cables, crossed in front of my Jeep, and lifted the hood, making me feel instant relief. Maybe this would work. I returned to my seat, hoping that soon the air conditioning would start working. As I experimented with the engine, the new man asked me to try turning it back on, and just as I started to relax, he surprised me by suddenly approaching the driver's side door. His expression changed dramatically, and in a concerned voice he asked me, "Ma'am, is this yours?" When I looked down at his hands, I froze. He was holding some sort of curved knife, with holes in the handle. It was an object that looked to be about 1.5 feet long, badly deteriorated and with rust stains on one end. It had these circular holes that I assumed were for putting my fingers in and gripping the object, as if it were a cross between a knife and a pair of scissors, something like that. My first reaction was astonishment. I wasn't scared, but I was definitely uncomfortable. "Where did you find it?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "It was under your hood," he replied, not taking his eyes off the strange object. I could tell he was pale, as if he couldn't find the right words at that moment. Meanwhile, I was just thinking that all I really wanted was for the Jeep to start and get out of there, but the curiosity about the strange object and the man's behavior were intertwined in my mind, making me feel that there was something much darker about it. The man said nothing more, simply set the dagger down on the curb, started his truck, and then motioned for me to try to start the Jeep. When the engine finally roared again, my 3-year-old started clapping his hands in delight, so I quickly turned the air conditioning on full blast, rolled up all the windows and pointed the louvers to the back, trying to keep the kids cool. I reached for my purse, thinking about how I was going to pay the guy. I ran out to him to ask him what I should do, but instead of giving me the bill, he headed back to my side of the car and picked up the odd piece. "Ma'am, I must have you look at it one more time," he said, raising the dagger earnestly. I moved a little closer to get a better look at it. The thing still looked strange, almost like a bayonet, with some small loopholes at the end. Honestly, I had never seen anything like it, and I commented on it as I held it up to him, but he spoke softly, as if he was trying to make me understand something important. "It wasn't supposed to be hidden in your engine. It was up there, which means someone put it there recently." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Oh, that's impossible," I smiled, trying to play it down. "Look how rusty it is," I replied. "Yeah, but look how sharp this blade is," he insisted as I stared at him. I realized he was right. The blade appeared to be sharp, especially at the tip where the rust was gone. You could see the sheen of polished metal. His last words resonated with me. "I don't know what was going to happen here, but I'm glad I got here when I did." At the end, I thanked him somewhat nervously, and as I passed him the money, he warned me that I would probably have to notify the police when I got home, but I decided to leave that thing right where it was. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to imagine what that man intended to do with it, so I just told him to do with it as he saw fit. The man felt, took the object and left, and that was the last time I saw that thing. I often wonder what would have happened if that guy hadn't come along just when he did. Would my kids still have a mother? Would I still be here? Those thoughts haunt me. But what I really learned that day is that sometimes exhaustion and desperation can cloud judgment. I always thought I was an observant person, good at interpreting others. But at that moment, exhausted and lost in an unfamiliar city, my common sense really went out the window. Many of my loved ones think that failure may have cost me my life, and while I will never know for sure, what I do know is that I need to be more vigilant. You never know what kind of threat may lurk in the dark.